North Texas, June 27, 1874. In the middle of the night, in the tiny settlement known as Adobe Walls, James Hanrahan steps outside the sod-roof saloon that he owns and operates. Hanrahan is alone, cloaked in the darkness of night, clutching a revolver. He is nervous and exhausted from the lack of sleep. More than anything, he wishes he could go inside, pour himself a stiff drink, and drift off to sleep until dawn brought on the repressive heat of yet another blazing Texas summer day. But he knows he cannot. Hanrahan knows what he must do. He aims the pistol into the air and squeezes the trigger. The tiny settlement, comprising only 4 buildings, is soon suddenly awash in activity as the remaining 27 men present, who are mostly recent arrivals, tired after their long journeys, are snapped out of their long-awaited slumbers to the report of the pistol. The shot sails harmlessly skyward as Hanrahan hurries back into his saloon and tucks the weapon away. As the small crowd of inhabitants who are making Adobe Walls their temporary home gather outside, questioning what the source of the loud noise was, Hanrahan stumbles back out of his sod-roofed establishment, breathlessly informing them that the noise has come from the cracking of a ridgepole that holds up the heavy sod roof of his building. This, if it were true, is a serious problem, as the ridgepole provides critical structural integrity to the primitive building by essentially holding up its heavy sod roof. This is a relatively common occurrence in the Old West, and the men know that a cracked ridgepole will have to be taken out and replaced immediately. As compensation for their efforts, the bartender offers up free drinks for all those pitching in to help. As the hours drag by and the men labor and drink, Hanrahan continually casts nervous glances outside the door. He knows the ridgepole is not, in fact, cracked. He knows that in the dimly lit building, in the middle of the night, it will be hard for even experienced repairmen to spot a small crack in the sizable ridgepole. Hanrahan's intentions are not to oversee any actual repairs, but simply to keep the men encamped here at Adobe Walls awake. He has received reports in the preceding days from informants that he keeps in the territory of a large war party gathering nearby, and, not wanting to drive away any of his business, has chosen not to share the reports with anyone else present. Out here on the open Texas plains, Hanrahan justifies to himself, reliable patronage is such a rarity that withholding news of an attack in order to ensure a steady flow of income is simply the cost of doing business. Aiding in Hanrahan's self-justification is the fact that his clientele are not exemplary of the typical American citizen at the time. Even amongst the rebellious and rowdy population of Texas, the regulars who indulge themselves in gambling and hard liquor at his establishment are rare in their capacity to endure danger and violence. His clientele, and the bulk of the not quite 30-strong population of Adobe Walls, is composed of buffalo hunters and skinners, otherwise known as hidemen. They are an unusually hardened and hardy lot, born from the boom in demand for buffalo hide. This boom has come after enterprising tanners on the East Coast developed a way to soften the hide so that manufacturers found it suitable, and in many ways ideal, for making everything from boots to coats to the leather straps used in the machinery now becoming ubiquitous in major urban centers with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. The buffalo hunters, who had once been employed by local army forts to harvest the mighty beasts for their meat to feed their troops, have, over the last several years, blossomed their grisly trade into its own industrialized operation. Their quarry, the imposing American bison, colloquially known as buffalo, present not only an enticing target, but an easy one for hunters familiar with their habits. The hulking animals cluster in large herds and do not flee until the lead animal among them is shot down. The hunters, many among whom are armed with the Sharps Model 1874 sporting octagon rifle with a 30-inch barrel chambered in .45 caliber, are able to set up hundreds of yards away from the herds, concealing their locations as they spent days at a time shooting down buffalo, one at a time. Over the course of the decade spanning from 1870 to 1880, the buffalo population of North America was utterly decimated. In 1870, there was thought to be more than 12 million buffalo roaming the plains. By 1880, there will be fewer than 400,000. After the animals are killed, the teams of men set about the tedious, tiresome, and outright filthy task of skinning the massive animals, storing the hides, as well as harvesting and salting the animals' tongues, which are prized delicacies in the cities of the eastern seaboard and in Europe. The carcasses are then left to rot, by the thousands, on the open expanses of the sun-soaked plains. This practice has increased in pace and scope beginning in the territory of Kansas, newly claimed after the Civil War, and rapidly expanding southward and westward into the territory belonging to tribes like the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. By this point in the 1870s, these once powerful tribes that had forfeited large swaths of their territory to the United States government are finding themselves in increasingly dire straits. As their territorial domain recedes, and the once expansive herds of buffalo are reduced exponentially year after year, the tribes of the central and southern plains are becoming increasingly angry and increasingly desperate. Their ire is drawn, in particular, by the teams of buffalo hunters who roam their lands and cut down the animals that they depend on, almost entirely, for their survival. In this area of North Texas, the Comanche have been hit particularly hard. Though they are still the most powerful tribe on the southern plains, their numbers have been decimated by outbreaks of dysentery, smallpox, and cholera over the preceding decades. Though once a mighty Spartan-like culture nearly devoid of formalized religious practices, they have recently begun to adopt an odd, rather ad hoc adaptation of the sun dance ritual performed by tribes with more developed religious practices like the Kiowa and the Cheyenne. They have spent much of the past few years being perpetually pursued by the U.S. Army, intermittently wreaking havoc on Texan and Mexican settlements as they struggle to recover from the ravages of the white man's diseases. Though they are still feared throughout the entirety of Texas, the Comanche people know that they are, as a whole, ailing. Thus, many among them have sought solace in medicine men claiming to have spiritual solutions to the Comanche's temporal problems. Foremost among these is a 23-year-old heavy-set and broad-faced man named Isatai. Though he is not a warrior, nor does he have any experience at all in tactics, strategy, or logistics, he has managed to convince the struggling and weary Comanche people that he is in possession of great power. Throughout the spring of 1874, he has been fostering his own legend. Comanche camps from all over the southern plains began to buzz with tales of this powerful young medicine man who, it was said, could stop bullets by casting spells, could actually fly into the sun to spend time with the spirits of the other world, and could belch up literal wagon loads full of bullets to supply the Comanche in their fight against the whites. Now was the time, Isatai had insisted as he traveled from camp to camp, for the Comanche to rise up, to join with their allies in the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, and to finally, once and for all, drive the American invaders from their lands. Though many amongst the Comanche would likely have dismissed the young Isatai out of hand were he traveling alone, it is his close friend, the legendary warrior Quanah Parker, whose endorsement lends great credence to his claims. Quanah, the half-white son of captured Texan Cynthia Ann Parker and Comanche chief Peta Nocona, has risen to prominence as a respected warrior and leader after being effectively orphaned when his father had been killed and his mother recaptured by the Texans during a raid a decade prior. Now, his opinion holds great sway amongst his people. In May of 1874, when the Comanche bands all gathered on the Red River for their attempt at a sun dance, Quanah and Isatai beseeched their ailing people to listen to their cries for uprising and follow them into the fight. Isatai had promised to make the warriors invincible and to render the Texans they planned to attack completely helpless with his powerful magic. They had managed to recruit warriors from their allies in the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, and now, after much speech-giving and testimony, they convinced many of their fellow Comanche to come on the warpath. Estimates place the size of their total force at between 250 to 1,000 warriors, with most erring towards the lower end of those numbers. Now, with their band of warriors in tow, Isatai and Quanah had the force they have dreamed of. They consulted with chiefs from all of the tribes, and it was a near universal conclusion amongst them that the biggest single problem facing the tribes on the southern plains at the moment was that of the buffalo hunters. Their incessant slaughter of the lifeblood of the tribes must be stopped at any cost. And so, the war party, after much secretive preparation and coalescence on the Texas plains, now makes their way towards Adobe Walls, headquarters of the buffalo trade in the North Texas country. Meanwhile, as the intertribal force of warriors make their final preparations for battle and then ride out towards Adobe Walls from across the plains, the buffalo hunters inside Hanrahan's sod-roofed saloon are just finishing their laborious task of replacing the supposedly cracked ridgepole of the ramshackle building. They have been thoroughly plied with free whiskey for their efforts, and many among them are ready to return to their bedrolls for some much-needed sleep. But Hanrahan, ever watchful of the eastern horizon as he awaits the sunrise, insists that they continue to stay and drink, free of charge, as a means of thanking them for their assistance. He intends to keep them all awake until the impending attack finally comes, and hopes that their senses will not be too dulled by alcohol to fight off the attackers. Finally, around 4 a.m., the party of Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, led by Isatai and Quanah, arrive on the ridgeline overlooking Adobe Walls. Isatai is completely naked and painted head to toe in yellow, the color of invincibility. Many of the warriors, as well as their horses, are also covered in yellow paint. 10 years earlier, in 1864, the legendary mountain man Kit Carson had led a U.S. Army contingent in search of Comanche raiders in a battle that had occurred in the adobe ruins that gave the place its name, which lay about a mile away from where the buffalo hunters now made their homes. Carson and his men had seen a sight eerily similar to this, and it was only through Carson's inexorable leadership and coolness under fire that he and his men were able to survive. But the buffalo hunters here on this day in 1874 not only lack discipline and leadership, they are largely half-drunk on rotgut whiskey and have been kept up all night performing hard physical labor. They are, in short, in less than ideal condition to fight a pitched battle against a highly experienced and incredibly motivated attacking force. However, these hunters do have one thing that their countrymen serving in the U.S. Army a decade earlier did not: the Sharps buffalo rifle. The imposing firepower possessed by this weapon, combined with the experience and combative nature of the buffalo hunters, will now prove to be their only hope of survival in the fight to come. As the morning sun begins to crest the eastern horizon, the imposing force of native warriors, with the exception of Isatai and a few select elders, charges down the hill, sweeping down upon the small settlement with startling skill, speed, and ferocity. William Dixon, a 23-year-old buffalo hunter who had come to Adobe Walls from Leavenworth, Kansas, by way of West Virginia, gives the following account of the initial morning charge. "There was never a more splendidly barbaric sight, and after years I was glad I had seen it. Hundreds of warriors, the flower of the fighting men of the southwestern plains tribes, mounted upon their finest horses, armed with guns and lances, and carrying heavy shields of thick buffalo hide, were coming like the wind. All over was splashed the rich colors of red, vermilion, and ochre on the bodies of the men, on the bodies of the running horses. Scalps dangled from bridles, gorgeous war bonnets fluttered their plumes, bright feathers dangled from the tails and manes of the horses, and the bronze, half-naked bodies of the riders glittered with ornaments of silver and brass. Behind this headlong charging host stretched the plains, on whose horizon the rising sun was lifting its morning fires. The warriors seemed to emerge from this glowing background." The cry goes up amongst the buffalo hunters that an attack is fast approaching, and all those who are awake race to grab their weapons and barricade themselves inside one of the 3 adobe buildings in the settlement. The walls are 2 feet thick, providing ample cover even from native rifle fire. However, outnumbered by at least 20 to 1, the buffalo hunters are well aware of their current predicament. They are also well aware of the vitriol the plains tribes carry for them, and know that the only thing worse than being killed on this day would be to be captured alive by the Comanche and their allies. The tales of unthinkable tortures wrought upon prisoners of war had circulated on the frontier for decades, and now served to steel the resolve of these intruding hidesmen as they steady the sights of their buffalo rifles on the approaching warrior horde. But the attack happens in a flash, leaving 2 buffalo hunters, the Shadler brothers, who had been asleep in one of the covered wagons stranded away from the cover of the adobe structures. They are quickly cut down, their pitiable cries drowned out in the din of gunfire and war cries. Their beloved dog, a large, sweet-natured Newfoundland, is also shot down in his efforts to defend his masters. All 3 are scalped. The attack roars on, and in a matter of moments is within range of the adobe buildings. One man, Billy Tyler, is shot through the lungs as he attempts to rush into one of the buildings in a futile dash for safety. The fight rages on, with the attacking tribesmen whirling in a cyclone of violence around the defenders ensconced in the buildings as they desperately fire out of the portholes cut into the walls. Quanah Parker, in the lead of the furious attack, attempts to batter down the door of Hanrahan's saloon by backing up his horse to the door and attempting to use its powerful legs to kick the door down. After a number of earnest attempts, though, the young warrior and seemingly fearless leader is forced to abandon his ploy in the midst of gunfire pouring out from the buffalo hunters inside. The warriors now attempt to set fire to the buildings, but the adobe walls and sod roofs make poor fuel for the flames, and the attackers are unable to accomplish much in the way of consequential damage. Finally, after suffering heavy initial losses at the hands of the buffalo hunters and their powerful rifles, a fate they had been assured was impossible by the medicine man Isatai, the attacking native forces pulled back to regroup on the ridge to the north. For the rest of the day, intermittent attacks rain down upon the besieged defenders. Time and again, they are repelled by the defenders, much to the confusion and consternation of the attackers. The attacks drag on into a second day. In between defending against charges, the defenders do their best to bury not only their dead, but veritable heaps of their own horses and oxen that the natives have killed in frustration when unable to breach the defenses of their human targets. More hope for the buffalo hunters comes in the way of reinforcements when 2 more hunters come into the camp from the surrounding area. One man is sent out to ride to Dodge City for reinforcements, leaving the total number of defenders at 30. Still, despite their advantages in mobility, numbers, and position, the native forces are unable to overrun their hated adversaries ensconced behind their thick adobe walls. On the 3rd day of what had become a siege, a number of warriors, along with Isatai, congregate on a hill that later estimates gauge to be 1,000 to 1,500 yards away from Hanrahan's saloon. The warriors and the medicine man sit atop their horses, presumably well outside the range of even the powerful buffalo guns, and quarrel over what to do next, and who is to blame for their difficulties so far. Isatai does his best to defend himself against his comrades' accusations of fraud and cowardice, and claims that the Cheyenne contingent of their multi-tribal force had killed and eaten a skunk on the eve of the attack, effectively nullifying Isatai's medicine. As the group of tribesmen squabbles amongst themselves, Billy Dixon, the 23-year-old hunter who, despite his youth, has already built a considerable reputation for himself as a crack shot, eyes them from nearly a mile away while standing in the doorway of Hanrahan's saloon. After a few moments of sizing up the distance and conditions, Dixon takes up his rifle and braces himself against the door jamb. "I was admittedly a good marksman," Dixon would later recall, "yet this was what one might call a scratch shot," meaning that, essentially, he simply aims as best as he can and hopes for the most efficacious result possible. Seconds after Dixon squeezes the trigger of his Sharps rifle, one of the native tribesmen in the group berating Isatai simply slumps over and falls to the ground, lifeless. Dixon's shot has, miraculously, fallen one of the warriors from a distance thought by nearly all present, including Dixon himself, to be essentially impossible. The group on the hill scatters instantaneously, having incurred yet another fatality, and now with their nerves irreparably shaken. Still though, throughout the day, more attacks are made, with Quanah Parker marveling many of the buffalo hunters with his strength and martial prowess, as he fearlessly charges again and again, and manages to lift a wounded comrade off the ground with one hand while sitting atop his horse. Finally, Quanah's horse is shot out from under him at a distance of nearly 500 yards. He takes cover behind a hulking, rotting buffalo carcass only to receive a bullet wound of his own between his neck and right shoulder blade. Ultimately, he is able to escape to safety, and while his wound will prove to be largely superficial, the damage that has been incurred by his forces is rapidly becoming unmanageable. The once prophetic Isatai now has no answers, and as dissension grows amongst the ranks of the Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, more buffalo hunters from the surrounding area pour in to assist in the defense of Adobe Walls. Several of the more experienced, older chiefs berate Isatai for causing such losses, beating him about the head and torso with their riding quirts. Though he can provide no solutions and still refuses to ride forth and fight the hunters himself, Isatai maintains his innocence. Soon, though, the native forces are rife with division and discouragement, and on the 4th day, they disappear into the expansive plains. After fighting for their lives for the better part of a week, the defenders holed up inside the buildings of Adobe Walls are elated. By August of that year, more than a month after the battle, a troop of cavalrymen arrived to Adobe Walls to find a dozen buffalo hunters still resolutely surviving in the remote outpost. Outside the saloon, each impaled on a post, are the skulls of several of the vanquished warriors. The Americans' fight for expansion and the tribe's fight for survival will not end here. Though Isatai will go on to be held in great contempt by his people, Quanah Parker will become a seminal figure in the tribe's history, and a pivotal force in leading the Comanche into their new way of life in the 20th century. Billy Dixon, the hunter who made the nearly impossible shot at Adobe Walls, would go on to be awarded the Medal of Honor, as a civilian, for his actions in a fight against the Comanche in Kiowa only months after this battle at Adobe Walls. Also present at the fight is a 20-year-old hunter and skinner named Bat Masterson, who will go on to become one of the Old West's most legendary figures, serving with the likes of Wyatt Earp and even going on to work as a newspaper correspondent in his later years. The Second Battle of Adobe Walls, as it will go on to be known, will shape the lives of virtually all those who fought there and managed to, somehow, survive. It will also be a pivotal moment in the history of the West, as it will, unofficially, mark the beginning of the end for the way of life of the tribes living on the plains. Never again will the buffalo range in such numbers, and never again will tribes like the Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho roam with such freedom. The tribes present will all go on to carry out retributive raids on homesteads and farms from Mexico to Colorado, though never again would they hold martial superiority over their own homelands. But the accounts of those raids, as well as the tales of the remarkable lives of such figures as Quanah Parker, Billy Dixon, and Bat Masterson, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. September 16th, 1868, eastern Colorado. As the late summer sun sinks into the horizon, a group of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors sit in a loose circle around a cooking fire, enjoying an evening meal. Among them is a 45-year-old Cheyenne warrior named Roman Nose. He is a decades-long veteran of countless battles against settlers and soldiers from the United States, as well as raids against rival tribes. In the illustrious career he has compiled, Roman Nose has accrued many honors and a reputation amongst his people, his allies, and his enemies as a formidable tactician and a vicious fighter. Since the devastating Sand Creek Massacre of November 29, 1864, in which dozens or possibly hundreds of his fellow Cheyenne, men, women, and children, were mowed down without mercy at the command of Colonel John Chivington, Roman Nose had extracted his proverbial pound of flesh from the encroaching white settlers with a myopic fury. He had been born into a band of the Northern Cheyenne, around the year 1823, son of a prominent warrior named Lone Bear and a beautiful and highly regarded mother named Black Buffalo Woman. Though as a child he had gone by the name Moseskanetsa Nunahe, or Bat, he had acquired the name Wokini, or Hook Nose, from his notable physical features, a name which the Americans would interpret as Roman Nose. He had fought at the Battle of Julesburg in Wyoming in 1865, and wrought terror and trepidation upon travelers all along the segment of the Oregon Trail that stretched to the northern plains. He had visited Fort Larned in April of the previous year, during which Isaac Coates, U.S. General Winston Scott Hancock's surgeon, observed Roman Nose in an argument with the general, noting that, "Of all the chiefs, he is one of the fittest specimens, physically, of his race. He is quite 6 feet in height, finely formed with a large body and muscular limbs. His appearance was decidedly military, and on this occasion particularly so, since he wore the uniform of a general in the army. A 7-shooting Spencer carbine hung at the side of his saddle, 4 large Navy revolvers stuck in his belt, and a bow, already strung with arrows, were grasped in his left hand. Thus armed and mounted on a fine horse, he was a good representative of the god of war, and his manner showed plainly that he did not care if we talked or fought." Though he holds no formal position of leadership within the Cheyenne, Roman Nose has built his stature within the tribe and their allies through countless battles, raids, and buffalo hunts. All throughout his travels and fighting, Roman Nose had fought fearlessly, partly due to his own personal resolve and disposition, and partly due to his belief that his war bonnet possessed a protective magic over him that afforded him protection from the white man's weapons. He had received the war bonnet as a gift from the Lakota warrior White Bull, who assured him no harm would come to him while he wore the headdress, so long as he did not violate its medicine by consuming any food prepared with the white man's metal utensils. Known amongst his people as a deeply spiritual man, Roman Nose abided by these directives fastidiously. In addition to following the prescription of White Bull, Roman Nose would partake in days-long fasts from food and water, often arriving late to battles due to his extensive prayer routine. Still though, despite his trademark tardiness, Roman Nose has, and especially the last few months, been the terror of the United States government, marauding about his high plains homelands, wreaking havoc and killing soldiers and settlers wherever he can. The preceding summer months have been busy, hot, and bloody. But now, for a brief moment, as he sits here with his fellow warriors enjoying a warm piece of fry bread freshly made by a Sioux woman serving as cook for the camp, all seems well, at least momentarily. Then, with all the disruption of a rifle's retort, the cry comes out from returning scouts that a contingent of white soldiers has been spotted nearby, and that an attack must be made as soon as possible. As he has so many times before, Roman Nose halts his meal and makes ready for the attack that will take place the next day. Just as he is making his way back to his lodge, one of his warrior cohorts rushes up to him, eyes wide in panic. The warrior informs Roman Nose that the Sioux woman who served them their dinner, not knowing of Roman Nose's prohibition against eating food prepared with metal utensils, had used a metal spoon to serve up their dinner. This action, though unintentional, now has resounding consequences. Roman Nose now believes his medicine, the great protection offered by his war bonnet, has been compromised. The Cheyenne medicine man's ceremony for ostensibly restoring the power to the headdress will take days, a luxury the mighty warrior does not now have. As the night drags on, Roman Nose contemplates his next move, the millstone of fate weighing heavy on his mind. Only 12 miles away, on the dry fork of the Republican River, on the south bank of what is known as Delaware Creek, 27-year-old First Lieutenant Frederick Henry Beecher works alongside his men preparing their camp for the night. They are a unique contingent of both U.S. Army soldiers and civilian frontiersmen, a combined force of 50 in number, assembled for the express purpose of pursuing and combating the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who have been so unyielding in their attacks in the previous few weeks. Commanding them is Major General George Alexander Forsyth of the 9th Cavalry, who had begun his career in 1861 as a lieutenant in the 8th Illinois Cavalry. Forsyth saw action in the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864, served as aide-de-camp for Major General Philip Sheridan, and had been awarded a brevet promotion to colonel on October 19th of 1864 for his actions during the Third Battle of Winchester and the Battle of Cedar Creek. Earlier in this year, he had been charged with assembling this motley band, whose ages ranged from their late teens to their early 60s. Beecher serves as second in command for this group, himself a veteran of the Civil War, acting as first lieutenant of the 16th Maine Volunteers from 1862 to 1864. He had fought at the Battle of Brooks Station, the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Battle of Chancellorsville, as well as the Battle of Gettysburg. He had been severely wounded twice, at both Fredericksburg on December 13, 1862, as well as Gettysburg on July 1st of 1863. At the Battle of Gettysburg, he had also received a citation for valor after refusing to surrender the regimental colors to the attacking Confederate forces. He was born in New Orleans in June of 1841 and graduated from Bowdoin College in Maine before volunteering for the Union Army. His family is one of prominent American stock, with his uncle Henry Ward Beecher being perhaps the most prominent Methodist preacher in America at the time. His aunt, Harriet Beecher Stowe, is perhaps the most famous writer in America, having authored the seminal fictional work in abolitionism at the time, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had served as a major media flashpoint in the galvanization of the country on the issue of slavery. His family is known as some of the most prominent and influential abolitionists in the whole of the Northeast, but they are also Americans, with a strident fidelity to their newly resolved union and possessing no small amount of fervor for the fulfillment of the notion of manifest destiny. The country, fresh out of conflict within itself, now seems, 3 years after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, unapologetically obsessed with their own reconstruction and expansion. Both reconstruction and expansion, though, have thus far come at great cost. In the South, unrest continues to run rampant, with the seeds of long-held resentments being sowed far and wide. In the West, the ongoing war between the United States government and the menagerie of tribes that range from Mexico to Canada has once again become red-hot after 4 years of a comparative lull in heavy fighting. Though conflict on the bleeding edge of the frontier had indeed raged throughout the entirety of the American Civil War, it was only after 1865 that the federal government could marshal the might of their full resources in the fight against the Plains tribes. The mere existence of this 50-man force, though, now unfurling their bedrolls and picketing their horses down for the night, is evidence of the U.S. Army's assessment of the situation on the high plains as a desperate one that calls for desperate measures if the attacks made by warriors who oftentimes have personal ties to those massacred by Shivington and company at Sand Creek are to ever be abated. On the morning of September 10th, this detachment had left Fort Wallace, located in present-day Kansas, following the trail of what they initially believed to be a force of 25 native warriors who had attacked a work detail roughly 13 miles from the fort. The trail, however, soon began to show signs of a far larger force of native Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors in the vicinity. This prospect, though, was an enticing one for many in the party, as the largest problem for many units fighting on the open plains was not as much in combating the native warriors in battle, but in actually finding them in the first place. The vast majority of the time, pursuing soldiers and citizens alike saw their attackers, or their quarry, depending on the situation, disappear with specter-like ease into the seemingly endless flat grasslands. Now, as men begin to doze off and others take their turns standing watch, the night drags on, under the splendor of the northern plains sky. Many amongst them have lost friends and loved ones to the attacks of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, and now burn for revenge that they hope is finally all too close at hand. However, even the most fervent pursuer amongst them would likely be shocked, and perhaps slightly horrified, to know that a massive camp of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, hundreds or perhaps thousands strong, lies only a dozen miles away from their force of 50 men. But when the sun breaches the eastern horizon on the morning of the 17th, the rude awakening for this small force is at hand, both literally and figuratively. Silhouetted by the rising sun, lining the ridge tops around them, are hundreds of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, resplendent in their war paint and letting loose war cries that jar awake those who have not yet been alerted by the men on watch. As First Lieutenant Beecher wipes the sleep from his eyes and takes stock of the situation at hand, his mind seems nearly unable to reconcile the bizarre sight before him. Not only are hundreds of warriors on the hilltops above them, but also are the wives and children of the warriors, looking on and exhorting their husbands and fathers to glory. Overseeing them from a distance is Roman Nose. Though not a formal chief, his leadership on the battlefield has been a pivotal element in the native warriors' successes in the preceding years. Now, as he watches on, Roman Nose fights a growing sense of self-consciousness as some among his people trade curious glances and hushed whispers as their best warrior only watches the battle about to take place. The word has gone out amongst the assembled Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho that no warrior should make any rash moves. Their prey is cornered, and, to the eyes of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors present, they are helpless. But as young men are often wont to do, a group of 8 teenage warriors make a foolhardy attempt at stampeding the soldiers' horses. Some of the 50 Americans fire upon them with their Spencer-repeating carbines, a new technology that allows rapid reloading as opposed to the muzzle-loading rifles and muskets of only a few years prior. Though none of the young warriors are killed in their attempt, the first shots of the fight have now been fired, and now a torrent of violence is unleashed, as rapid charges are made upon the small camp, with war cries filling the air, mixing with the sounds of commands in English and the cheering of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho women and children in their respective languages. As the attacks persist, First Lieutenant Beecher coolly and calmly fires upon the charging warriors, while encouraging his men to take accurate shots and remain courageous despite their obvious numerical disadvantage. First in command, Major General Forsyth orders the men to retreat across the shallow waters of the river to a small, desolate island located midstream between the north and south banks. Forsyth and Beecher assist their 48 men in forming a barricade with the very horses they had led across the river, tying the animals off to bushes and taking cover behind them. Almost as soon as the men are able to take their positions behind their unfortunate means of cover, another series of attacks ensues, again swarming down upon them seemingly from all directions. One after another, the horses tied off to the bushes are felled by arrows and bullets from the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. As the men continue to take fire, more and more among them recognize the riotous crack of the rifles carried by the native warriors. The chilling realization falls upon the men, now ensconced upon this barren strip of earth in the middle of a sparse high-plain stream, that they are being fired upon with Henry and Spencer repeating rifles. Some of these weapons have been procured by the warriors from both prior victories, such as the utter massacre wrought upon the cavalry in the Fetterman Massacre of a year and a half prior. Some of the repeating rifles, though, a technology that had been a singular means of advantage for the U.S. cavalry over the Plains tribes, had been provided by the United States government's Bureau of Indian Affairs, under the pretense that they would only be used for hunting. Despite the vehement assertions to the contrary from countless correspondence penned by Army officers in the field to their superiors in Washington, D.C., besieging them to stop this clearly conflicting practice, no such effort has been made by this summer of 1868. Now, as their horses are being killed by bullets funded by their own government, the men on the island's situation is rapidly becoming more and more dire. Forsyth and Beecher agree that the only course of action left is to kill the remaining horses and order the men to dig in more substantial breastworks behind the animals' bodies. As things are, the men are far too exposed, and their small force can now only hope to hunker down and hold their position. As the iron stink of blood and viscera permeate the air, the men dig in desperate, intermittent fits, stopping only to fire on assailing bands of attacking warriors who incessantly pester them with attacks. Some of the warriors take a more surreptitious route of attack, sneaking into the thick grass that lines the riverbanks and sniping at the men now effectively trapped on the island. As the fight drags on, the mighty Roman Nose continues to watch from a distance. Initially, he had thought that his participation in the fight today may indeed prove unnecessary. With the enemy trapped and assumed to be at the mercy of antiquated weaponry, he had hoped this might be a chance for some of the younger warriors to make their own marks in their initial forays into combat. But as the afternoon sun burns brighter and hotter, and more young warriors fall to the Americans' repeating rifles, Roman Nose becomes more and more burdened by his own internal dialogue heaping guilt upon himself. Then, an old Cheyenne woman, observing this revered warrior not participating in the fight, begins to mercilessly chastise him. She browbeats him with accusations of laziness and, worse, cowardice, charging that the lives of young warriors lost today will be due to his reticence to act. Finally, Roman Nose can take no more. "I will die," he says, in a low, resigned tone, "but I will go." Despite the gravity of the situation, Roman Nose fastidiously paints his face and torso, checks his weapons, says his prayers, and finally dons his legendary war bonnet. The war bonnet itself speaks to the bizarre and desperate nature of the fate of these two groups brought together here today in combat in one of the most austere environments on the continent. The following is a description of the bonnet itself, made years later by the warrior who had constructed it, White Bull, as told by George P. Grinnell. Instead of having two buffalo horns attached at the headband, one on each side, it had but one rising over the center of the forehead. It had a very long tail that touched the ground, even when Roman Nose was mounted. This tail was made of a strip of young buffalo hide and had eagle feathers all along its length. First 4 red feathers, then 4 black ones, then 4 red feathers again, and so on. 40 feathers in all. For 8 years, Roman Nose has participated in fight after fight, in full confidence that the medicine from his headpiece will protect him from harm. Now, believing its powers compromised and that it will serve merely as an ornament in his own demise, he pulls the war bonnet down upon his head and rides out with a small group of fellow warriors to make an attack on the island. Again, as they had countless times before, he and his fellow warriors steel their nerves in the last seconds before urging their war horses forward at full speed towards the small island. The attack comes on, with the Americans at the island holding their fire until the mighty warriors are only 50 yards away before unleashing a volley of fire from their repeating rifles, followed in rapid succession by another and another. In the melee, Roman Nose is grievously wounded by a bullet to his torso. After a short fight, the force retreats over the hilltops and back to the village. Here, the mighty Roman Nose is pulled from his horse, his condition rapidly declining due to organ damage and loss of blood. He is taken inside of one of the lodges where medicine is applied to his wound, but his condition continues to rapidly deteriorate. By sunrise, the legendary Cheyenne warrior, who had fought so long for so hard without incurring so much as a scratch, lies cold in death inside one of the buffalo hide lodges of the village. Wails and lamentations resound, as the loss of such a great warrior and treasured friend is one felt as palpably here on the Great Plains as it is anywhere in the long and brutal course of history. Meanwhile, back on the island, Major General Forsyth now lies prostrate, grievously wounded himself by a bullet lodged in his thigh, dangerously close to his femoral artery. He props himself up on one elbow, giving directions and doing his best to address his own wounds. Suddenly, another charge comes on. Again, the succeeding minutes are filled with the din of gunfire and war cries, until again, the warriors retreat, and all on the island falls silent. Suddenly, to Major General Forsyth and the men's eternal shock and horror, First Lieutenant Beecher wearily stands up, seemingly in some kind of battle-induced stupor. He then falls to one knee, and begins to drag himself towards Forsyth. Beecher cries out, "I have my death wound, General. I am shot in the side, and dying." Forsyth desperately scrambles towards his friend. "No, Beecher, no," he manages to cry out, as the young first lieutenant falls. "Yes, good night," Beecher manages to stoically mumble before his eyes close, and the soldier who had survived the horrors of so many battles utters his final words, "My poor mother." Forsyth and the men now find themselves in a state of shock and nearing despair as they lie prone, several of them injured, and now, with a total of 4 of their forces, including Beecher, Sergeant J. H. Moores, George W. Culver, and William Wilson, also lying dead on the small island in this shallow stream. Their proximity to death, in both time and space, has severely unnerved every man present, whether military or civilian. As the sun sets and a long, worrisome night unfolds, Forsyth considers his options. In the middle of the night, the men huddle behind the swelling and stinking carcasses of their horses and devise a plan. They cannot stay here, it is obvious to all. However, with all of their mounts now serving as defensive breastworks, their only means of escape will be on foot, in the middle of the high plains, with hundreds of warriors swarming the area. This is tantamount to suicide. Still, it is their only hope. Forsyth beseeches the men that someone will have to make the trek to Fort Wallace to request assistance. A 19-year-old named Simpson Jack Stillwell and a veteran French-Canadian trapper named Pierre Avalanche Trudeau, a man thought to be in his 60s but said to look much older, volunteered to make the 70-mile journey southeast, knowing that being caught will mean a certain, horrific death. The men depart before sunrise, walking backwards across the stream in hopes of deterring the native warriors who will eventually surely pursue them. They vanish into the night, and soon the sun rises on another day of hard fighting. Throughout the next 2 days, the intermittent charges from the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors continue, now made even more frequently on foot, with the warriors sneaking as close to the island as possible before springing their attack. The fighting is a hard business, and as the hours drag on, it is believed that the 2 men sent to garner reinforcements have likely been caught and killed in their efforts. After 2 more nights, Major General Forsyth is now faced with 2 pressing dilemmas. One, the men he has sent out are now likely dead, and the only solution is to send another 2 men in hopes of completing a similar distance trek to a stagecoach stop due south of their present location. Here, They can wait for the next stagecoach to Fort Wallace. Scouts John J. Donovan and Allison J. Plilly volunteer for the task, and soon slip across the stream and over the horizon themselves, into the dead of night and dreadful uncertainty. The next problem to be addressed is the bullet lodged in Major General Forsyth's thigh. Rectile is pressing precariously against his femoral artery, and the wound is rapidly becoming vulnerable to infection. However, with the head surgeon having already been killed, Forsyth is unable to convince any of his men to try their hand at the rudimentary frontier surgery required to remove the bullet from his leg. This being the case, Forsyth does so himself, miraculously managing to safely remove the bullet and bandage his injured leg with only a knife as his instrument. Though he is successful in removing the bullet, the fever and ensuing infection leave many in Forsyth's command, believing that he will soon join his friend Beecher in death. Meanwhile, by some other miracle, both rescue parties sent out, that of Stillwell and Trudeau, as well as that of Donovan and Plilly, made their way to Fort Wallace, arriving only hours apart. Reinforcements are marshaled, and on the 25th of September, a full 8 days after killing their horses and digging in behind their corpses, the surviving men left trapped on the island are greeted with the sight of eventual Medal of Honor recipient Lieutenant Colonel Lewis H. Carpenter and his 10th Cavalry Regiment of the famed Buffalo Soldiers, comprised of newly freed slaves who have volunteered to serve in the dangerous world of the U.S. Army's cavalry. Carpenter and the Buffalo Soldiers themselves are greeted with the sight of 50 dead and rotting horses, as well as 5 dead and rotting bodies of their fellow Americans, as well as the unyielding stench of a week's worth of death and decomposition in combination with a huge swarm of black flies. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, having seen the fight, at least on the whole, as merely another engagement, despite its tragic cost, have now grown tired of making charges on the doomed island and have, in the words of author Terry Mort in his work Cheyenne Summer, made their egress much in the fashion of an audience exiting a theater after a long performance. 5 full days later, on September 30th, the rescue force, as well as the men who had been trapped on the island, forever now known as Forsyth's Scouts, make their way back into the relative safety of the confines of Fort Wallace. Major General Forsyth will go on to survive his wounds, which included another gunshot wound to his torso and a grazing wound to his head, and he will go on to a long career in the U.S. Army. Ultimately, Walter Armstrong, one of the scouts wounded during the fight, will die of his wounds in hospital. He will be buried at Fort Wallace, while his fallen cohorts in Culver, Farley, Wilson, the surgeon Dr. Moores, and First Lieutenant Beecher would all be buried on the island where they fell. Though the course of the river has changed throughout the years, rendering the original site of his grave unknowable, the island itself is today known as Beecher's Island. The final resting place of Roman Nose is, as well, lost to the march of history. After the battle, his body was placed atop a funeral pyre and left to be consumed by the animals and elements, as was the tradition of the Cheyenne. Upon learning about the fight at Beecher's Island, another famous frontier figure, General George Armstrong Custer, remarked that it was the greatest battle on the plains. The consequences of the battles of Beecher's Island would have reverberations that would be felt throughout the next bloody decade of conflict on the plains between the United States Army and tribes like the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Blackfoot, and Comanche. But the stories of those battles, like the bloody tale of Custer's final fight at the Little Bighorn or the tragic massacre at Wounded Knee, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Northern Wyoming, December 21st, 1866. As battle cries and screams of agony ring out all around him, 32-year-old Adolf Metzger is in a desperate fight for his life. Tucked back into the scarcely discernible shelter of a crevice amidst a field of boulders, the young German-born immigrant fights ferociously, swinging his weapon with all of his might as guttural exhortations fly unconsciously from his lips. His attackers, who have all but laid waste to his comrades, are a collection of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, hundreds strong, fighting under the command of the legendary Red Cloud. They wield bows, arrows, lances, knives, and tomahawks and advance upon their ensconced quarry, with the myopic fury of a hungry pride of lions. Metzger, for his part, wields only a small brass instrument, a bugle, that he desperately swings as dozens of lances and arrows berate his position. To a random passer-by, this spectacle would doubtless appear curious, if not slightly comical, were it not for the deadly serious consequences of the fight at hand. But, as curious as the sight might be, it is anything but a random encounter. Adolf Metzger is a soldier in the United States Army, serving in the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, C Company. At 5 feet 8 inches tall, with brown hair and blue eyes, he cuts a similar figure to many of his comrades who now lie cold in death around his position. He serves as the company bugler, a critical position in a time before radio communication. Metzger's job is to belt out the appropriate tunes on the bugle to denote attacks, retreats, and various maneuvers. The U.S. Army has determined that buglers need both hands free in order to properly execute their duties, and thus, the only weapon that Metzger has left is the diminutive brass instrument, with which he now makes a desperate last stand. Though he now stands here incurring the consequences of the United States government's repeated offenses against the Northern Plains nations, Metzger is but a poor soldier, at the mercy of his commanders and his duty. 6 months earlier, in June of 1866, the 2nd Cavalry, under the command of Colonel Henry B. Carrington, had ridden out of Fort Laramie in what is today southeastern Wyoming and into what is known as the Powder River Country with orders to protect immigrants traveling on the Bozeman Trail. A treaty had been agreed to with most of the powerful Northern Plains nations in 1851, including the Cheyenne, Lakota, Arapaho, Assiniboine, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Crow tribes. Signed in the very fort Carrington had ridden out of, it is known as the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. The treaty had designated this area in the Powder River Country as belonging to the Crow tribe, and guaranteed it immunity from incursion by either rival tribes or American settlers. However, a decade and a half of dwindling buffalo herds and increasing encroachment from westbound immigrants has driven the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho into more and more desperate straits. Fed up with the lack of trustworthiness exhibited by the United States government, the mighty Red Cloud has gathered a formidable army of highly motivated warriors intent not only on forestalling westward expansion, but on eliminating every soldier, settler, and rival tribe from their territory for good. While many of the soldiers now serving in the post-Civil War Army are indeed accustomed to combat and the hardships of life on the trail, none of them, nor their superiors, have seen anything like the warfare being waged upon them by Red Cloud. For the next few months, after their arrival in the Powder River Country, as they labored and constructed the fort that would be their home, the soldiers dealt with incessant attacks from warriors riding under the command of Red Cloud. Even after the fort was completed, Colonel Carrington was reticent to send any patrols outside of its walls in order to engage and deter the constant onslaught of piecemeal attacks. As the casualties mounted and the frustration amongst the ranks grew, Harrington's subordinate officers, most notably Captain William Fetterman, began to insist more and more vociferously that the only way to stop the attacks was to take the fight to Red Cloud and his warriors. Carrington and Fetterman had both served in the Union Army during the Civil War, though both men had had wildly different experiences throughout the conflict. While both had served honorably, Carrington, a Yale-educated officer and highly regarded as a masterful bureaucrat, had not seen combat on the front lines. Instead, he had solidified his reputation as a tireless organizer and, by war's end, had become head of a Union spy ring being run out of Indianapolis. Carrington, as well as his superiors, saw this excursion into the Powder River Country as an opportunity to garner the 42-year-old a measure of actual combat experience and pad his otherwise exemplary record. Whether due to his disposition, inexperience, or simply differing discernment of the situation at hand, Carrington had repeatedly denied his officers permission to pursue the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. By December of 1866, this had caused an increasing level of discontent amongst nearly everyone ensconced within the timber confines of the fort. While no major engagements had taken place, it seemed to the inhabitants of the fort that one or two of them were turning up dead with alarming regularity. Among the most vocal proponents of taking up a more offensive course of action against the native attackers is Captain Fetterman. In stark contrast to his superior officer, Captain Fetterman has seen frontline action in the Civil War. he had participated in the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, as well as Sherman's March. After the conclusion of the Civil War, Fetterman had stayed in the U.S. Army with the intentions of becoming a career officer. Though Fetterman's father had served as an officer in the Army, he had been orphaned as a young man and in his late teens denied entrance into West Point. Though he had gone on to assemble an impressive military resume, the combined lack of both a familial and educational pedigree imbued the captain with a burning sense of ambition. Though it was not an uncommon exhortation amongst American officers on the plains, Fetterman had repeatedly claimed that with a force of 80 men, he could wipe out the entire Sioux nation. Finally, after being ordered by General George Cooke to take the offensive against the murderous and insulting attacks, Carrington began to take a more aggressive approach against Red Cloud and his warriors. On December 6th, Carrington received word that a wagon train of woodcutters was under attack. The woodcutters, men whose job of venturing out into the nearby woods to procure timber was quickly becoming one of the most dangerous professions on the frontier, were roughly 4 miles west of the relative safety of the fort walls. Immediately grasping the gravity of the situation, Carrington ordered Fetterman to lead a company of cavalry and a squad of mounted infantry directly to the scene, while he led another attachment north to cut off the retreat of the warriors. Carrington had, in fact, made tactically astute decisions. However, 2 young lieutenants named Drummond and Bingham had led 3 other troops in pursuit of a small group of warriors, only to wind up in an ambush. Drummond and 2 others had managed to escape, narrowly making it back to rejoin their commander with several of Red Cloud's warriors in hot pursuit. Carrington had then found himself and the remainder of his contingent surrounded by roughly 100 warriors. However, with the arrival of Fetterman and his backup, the attacking warriors were compelled to retreat north, disappearing over the rolling hills. As Carrington and his men re-entered the walls of Fort Kearny, it was all too obvious to those of them that had seen combat in the Civil War that this, combat on the open plains, would be an altogether different business. Those who had never experienced combat before this were chilled to the bone by the realization that they were all a very long way from home, with limited support, surrounded by their enemy in their enemy's own land. It must have seemed to many that their saving grace would indeed be their faction's superior technology. While U.S. Army soldiers who had fought the Plains tribes prior to the Civil War had been largely armed with single-shot rifles and early iterations of the Colt revolver, these men were equipped with weapons developed largely over the course of the preceding 6 years. The officers among them generally carried the Model 1860 Colt or 1858 Remington 44 caliber revolvers. The typical infantryman carried the Springfield Model 1863 rifle musket chambered in .58 caliber, while the typical cavalryman was armed with either a Spencer Model 1860 52 caliber or Model 1865 50 caliber 7-shot repeating carbine. The warriors fighting under Red Cloud are largely armed with only their traditional bows, lances, shields, and war clubs, with only a few warriors armed with 44 caliber revolvers and single-shot flintlock rifles. This discrepancy in firepower is, it is now obvious to most, the only thing keeping them alive here in the unforgiving austerity of the snow-laden Powder River country. In their after-action reports, Carrington and Fetterman concurred that the lack of discipline and organization exhibited by the troops during the engagement was indeed cause for great concern. Fetterman commented that this Indian war has become a hand-to-hand fight, requiring the utmost caution. The one man in the fort with significant experience in fighting the tribes of the northern plains was the 62-year-old legendary mountain man, trapper, scout, explorer, and frontiersman Jim Bridger, who served as a lead scout for Carrington. Bridger, who for weeks had observed the increasing difficulties of the young soldiers in dealing with the attacks from the native warriors, remarked to the general that, "Your soldiers don't know anything about fighting Indians." Carrington had immediately redoubled the training of his troops, drilling them incessantly and making abundantly clear to the officers, time and again, that caution must be exercised in all engagements, attacks must be limited, and all maneuvers made in the interest of minimizing their men's exposure to danger. The number of guards on duty was doubled, and all of the 50 remaining horses of the fort were to remain saddled from dawn to dark in case of an immediate need. On December 19th, the drilling and precautions seemed to have paid off when General Carrington had ordered a captain named Powell to assist a group of woodcutters under attack. Following his orders with scrupulous detail, Powell had indeed managed to force the attacking warriors into retreat. He had not allowed any pursuit of the warriors and had returned safely with the woodcutting detail in tow. The following day, Carrington had refused the request of Captain Fetterman and Captain Brown, another veteran officer, to take a contingent of well-armed civilian employees of the fort on a raid to disperse or capture a Lakota village situated roughly 50 miles away on the Tongue River. This almost certainly saved the lives of all the proposed participants, as the village was much larger and much more ready to make war than the captains realized. However, the cavalrymen's respite from the cold of death would be tragically all too brief. It would be only a day later, on December 21st at about 10 a.m., when General Carrington was alerted of a band of warriors yet again harassing a party of woodcutters. The morning had been clear and cold, and while another attack had been expected, most had hoped their advancing from the fort might come in the comparatively warmer hours of the afternoon. By all accounts of those present, Carrington gave Captain Fetterman clear orders not to pursue the warriors over Lodge Trail Ridge that lay to the north of the fort. He was only to proceed northwest, reinforce the security detail accompanying the woodcutting party, and return. Under no circumstances, Carrington ordered, are you to pursue over the ridge to the north. Captain Fetterman departed the fort not long after 10 a.m. Captain Brown, soon to receive orders to leave the fort and loath to pass up one last opportunity at avenging his fallen countrymen, volunteered to go as well. Issuing the call to advance outside the gates had been Adolph Metzger, whose steady intonations hid a growing unease rapidly taking hold of his nerves. Marching forward under the directives of Metzger's bugle is the largest relief force yet sent out by Carrington, including a detachment of infantrymen on foot. Leading a small detachment of cavalry assigned to support these men on their way to the battlefield is Lieutenant George Drummond, who only days earlier had narrowly escaped death by impetuously pursuing a party of warriors into the ambush that had killed Lieutenant Bingham and another soldier. As the gates to the fort closed, Carrington retreated to his quarters, by all accounts relatively confident in Fetterman's fidelity to his orders, but concerned about the discipline of Lieutenant Bingham, considering his actions on the previous few days. However, with limited men and limited time, he still felt that Bingham was more of an asset than a liability. However, within the hour, before 11 a.m., Carrington would be alerted that Fetterman had, despite his explicit orders, pursued the party of attacking warriors to the north. Within the confines of the fort, the situation is maddeningly inexplicable to the general. Later accounts of the battle from Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho sources shed light on what might have provoked an attack that should have been explicitly prohibited under direct order. Among the warriors attacking the wagon train on this icy northern plains morning is a young warrior with oddly light skin and wavy hair. He had been spotted before by the soldiers and woodcutters alike, standing out not only for his appearance, but his unyielding ferocity. Again and again, when other warriors had retreated, or worse yet, fallen in death, the young man had proven indefatigable in assaulting his enemy. His own people, too, were increasingly impressed with his bravery and selflessness. Though still in his early 20s, the young man was beginning to cultivate a reputation as a fearless warrior and trustworthy leader. As a child, because of his hair, he had been known as Curly. Now, he is known amongst his people as Tisonka Whitco, or Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse and company, upon seeing the arrival of Captain Fetterman and his men, see yet another opportunity to employ one of their favorite tactics, a feigned retreat. In hopes of drawing the army officer's ire and enticing him to follow their feigned retreat into an ambush, Crazy Horse hurls repeated insults at Fetterman and his men, cursing them in English and striking threatening poses as a challenge. Finally, in either desperation or disgust, Crazy Horse had turned his back to the soldiers, dropped his leather leggings, and mooned them. Whether or not this insult is indeed the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, Fetterman's men did indeed give chase. One possibility later proffered by researchers is that it was in fact Grumman, again at the mercy of his own vainglorious impulses, who broke ranks and began to lead the charge. As the pursuit carried on northward, Grumman and the bulk of the force pulled ahead of Fetterman, Brown, and the remainder of the force by several hundred yards. As they proceeded over the crest of Lodge Trail Ridge, however, they are met with what must have been a sickeningly bone-chilling sight. Thousands of warriors stood ready to meet them. The attack was not sprung until Grumman and his party were near the bottom of the ridge, with Fetterman and Brown between them and the fort. At first, an attempt to stand their ground is made. Then, quickly seeing the futility of this approach, Grumman, leading the contingent of troops furthest down the hill, begins to lead a fighting retreat up the steep slope, intending to reunite with Fetterman. Now, as the battle rages on, the attacking Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho have managed to separate the two forces further. Though he fights valiantly and attempts to lead the men who have followed him back up the hill, Grumman is soon cut down in vicious hand-to-hand combat. As the infantry desperately slip and slide as they attempt to climb their way up the hill, they too are cut down in brutal fashion by arrows, clubs, and spears. Soon, the white snow of the hillside is stained in large swatches of blood and viscera. Fetterman and Brown lead the men still alive under their command to an outcropping of boulders, from where they presumably intend to hold out until reinforcements arrive. They squeeze off round after round, desperately trying to issue orders over the din of rifle fire, war cries, and the screams of the wounded and dying. It is mere minutes, however, before Captain Fetterman is cut down by a hulking Sioux warrior named American Horse, with a devastating blow from his nail-studded war club, after which the warrior leaps from his horse and cuts the American's throat. The outcropping is overrun in short order, with troopers falling all around in their final throes of agony as they are brutalized by attacking warriors. Knowing the fate that now awaits him, Captain Brown fires off every remaining round in his revolver, saving the last for himself. Before he can be overtaken and subjected to the torturous demise of his comrades, Captain Brown falls dead by his own hand. Among the last left alive is Adolf Metzger, who now knows he has but moments left to live. As the hellish reality unfolds around him, perhaps his mind indeed recalls a brief synopsis of his life. Scenes he will never see again. The German countryside of his youth, the countless charges he had survived during the previous few years, and doubtless recollections of his worried mother and beloved, long-suffering wife, Frederica, whom he had married while still on campaign in the summer of 1864. This respite, though, must last only moments. As Metzger continues to swing his instrument, the bugle incurring dents as his body incurs slashes and stab wounds. He backs further into the crevice, now with no room left to retreat. The scene over the next few minutes is one of unabated brutality, as Metzger too is slashed, cut, and bludgeoned until he finally falls dead on the cold Wyoming ground. The last American soldier left alive during this engagement, one that will come to be known as the Fetterman Massacre, or Fetterman's Fight, is now gone. To the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, the success of their tactics is inarguable. Before this battle, a Sioux medicine man had reported having a dream, in which he had held 100 dead blue-coat soldiers in each hand. In the lore of the Sioux, the battle is known as the Battle of the 100 in the Hand. This engagement would be the most costly ever inflicted upon the U.S. Army until a full decade later, when many of the same warriors would decimate Custer's forces at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. For Red Cloud, the utter devastation wrought upon the U.S. Army in this engagement is but a pretense of things to come. The Battle of the 100 in the Hand is but one engagement in what will come to be known as Red Cloud's War, the most successful military campaign ever led by native forces against the United States Army. But the epic tale of how the mighty Sioux chief managed to bring to bear the power of his leadership and his people's resolve in one of the greatest military campaigns in the history of the Old West, as well as the story of how General Carrington responded to the tragic massacre of his men, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Wyoming, August 2nd, 1867. Just before 7 a.m., 18-year-old Samuel Gibson peers out from over the top of a wagon box, eyes wide and pulse quickening as he surveys the horrifying scene that lies before him. Hundreds of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors swarm all around the enclosure made of simple wooden wagons detached from their wheels. From here, Gibson and 31 other men, a combination of soldiers and civilian laborers, will now, in very short order, be forced to fight for their very lives. They are a mix of veterans, old hands, and teenagers, all from a variety of backgrounds. They have all, however, heard the accounts of what happened to the men who had been killed by many of these same warriors less than a year earlier on December 21st of 1866. The day after the dreadful battle, the commanding officer of the nearby Fort Kearny, then Colonel Henry Carrington, led a detachment of cavalry to the site of the battle, where they were greeted with the horrifying sight of their comrades' bodies strewn about a frozen landscape in various stages of degradation. His personal account of the event included descriptions of the bodies of soldiers that had been scalped, eviscerated, emasculated, their tongues, ears, and noses cut off, and bludgeoned until their faces were unrecognizable to even their close comrades. News of the massacre had been the talk of aghast Easterners in cities like New York and Philadelphia for weeks in the early part of 1867. All across the territory, settlers and soldiers alike kept their eyes nearly perpetually cast to the horizon in search of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors known to be riding under the command of the legendary Red Cloud. The mere mention of the name Red Cloud often stirred up simultaneous feelings of intense rage and primal terror amongst the inhabitants of Fortville Kearny. To some degree or another, nearly all feared befalling a fate like that of their cohorts in the Fetterman Massacre. Now, for the men trapped inside this ad hoc fortification of wagons and supply boxes, the reality staring them starkly in the face is that they might suffer the same fate today as their unfortunate comrades had only months earlier. As the young Gibson surveys the horrifying scene, he and the others busy themselves with the cold, hard necessities of preparation for combat. With several thousand rounds of ammunition on hand, they are in fact amply armed, in combination with their Springfield repeating rifles, to combat the threat at hand, despite their numerical disadvantage. In what initially seems to be an inexplicable scene, Gibson sees several of the older veterans hurriedly stripping off one of their boots and tying a 3-foot length of cord to their big toe, while tying a larger loop left hanging inside the trigger guards of their rifles. In the event that they are overrun, the men intend to slide the larger loop over the trigger and deprive their attackers of a live prisoner. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors now amassing all around them have already completed their battle preparations, having daubed themselves and their ponies in their bright war paint, filled their quivers, loaded their rifles, and checked to see that their bowstrings are taut. The Sioux, known amongst themselves as the Lakota, are the largest amongst them in number. Hailing from their ranks, in addition to their leader Red Cloud, is a young warrior rapidly building a reputation as a fierce and fearless fighter known as Tashanka Whitco, or Crazy Horse. The Cheyenne and Arapaho hail from the northern ranges of present-day Colorado and Wyoming, and though they are two decidedly distinct cultures, they have been longtime allies and are often seen by many as inseparable entities. These mighty tribes, each comprising their own highly capable and highly consequential patch on the proverbial quilt of the Northern Plains peoples, have come together and put aside any lingering disputes in order to pursue their common enemy in the Americans. Though the driving force in this desire is the decades, if not centuries, of encroachment on these lands they claim as their own, they are also keen to build their own reputations as warriors, unafraid to fight and die for their people. These warriors are actually the larger contingent of a group that is split off from another roving band of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho who, unbeknownst to their comrades at this moment, have spent the previous day engaged in a vicious fight against another contingent of civilian workers and Army soldiers outside Fort C.F. Smith in present-day Montana. That fight had resulted in many of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors being cut down by the ultimately overwhelming firepower the Americans were able to wield with the advent of their new rifles. In the preceding decades of warfare between the tribes of the Northern Plains and the U.S. Army and American settlers, the Americans had been at the mercy of their diminutive rate of fire. Prior to the invention of the breech-loading repeating rifle, rifles were loaded via a cumbersome loading process that limited even experienced users to but a few rounds in a minute. Until now, The tactics of most Plains tribes have consisted of essentially evoking and then weathering the first volley of rifle fire, after which an advance could be made while the Americans hurried to reload in time. Comparatively, though they also possessed rifles, the rate of fire that could be produced by a well-trained warrior with a traditional bow and arrows dwarfed that laid down by the American rifles. Countless times on the American frontier, from Texas to Montana, soldiers and settlers alike were overrun and cut down, suffering fates much the same as those of the unfortunate souls at Fetterman's Massacre. While advancements in weapon technology had certainly been made, perhaps most notably with the advent of the rise of the Colt Patterson and Colt Walker revolvers, the need for a rifle capable of a greater rate of fire had long been an apparent one on the frontier. Now, though, in a scant few years since the Americans' Great Civil War had concluded and so many more had flooded westward, the repeating rifle had drastically altered the landscape of Plains warfare dynamics. But while the Americans have their new weapon in their rifles, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors assembling all around the desperate men inside the ring of wagon boxes have an invaluable weapon of their own, the thus far incomparable leadership of their trusted leader, Red Cloud. Though his presence at the battle today is disputed by historians, his leadership and command are, regardless, palpable. As the young warriors whip themselves into a fury, knowing that many will inevitably meet their ends today, they fill the air with cries of "Hoka-hey," or "It is a good day to die." Back inside the wagon box fort, the commanding officers, Captain James Powell and Captain John Jeunesse, survey the situation at hand. Jeunesse has one eye closed, and the other tucked snugly into the eyepiece of his army telescope. He informs Captain Powell that he believes he has indeed spotted Red Cloud. Understandably, this adds another layer of dread to the men preparing themselves to engage the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Lakota in battle. As the officers discuss any final necessities in hushed tones, an appalling silence falls over the rest of the men, as they peer out in all directions at the warriors intent on ending their mortal stay before the sun sets on this day. The teenaged Private Samuel Gibson, though already a veteran of several small skirmishes, but wholly new to combat on this level, attempts to question his older cohorts as to what they think their chances might be in the fight to come. "You're gonna have to fight like the Dickens if you want to get out of today alive, kid," remarked one, referring to him under his deceptively endearing nickname. Finally, overcome by the same resolve as his elder companions, the young man begins the process of removing one of his own boots and tying a cord to his big toe. Just as Gibson finishes tying his first loop, however, the call comes down from Captain Powell. "Men, here they come. Take your places and shoot to kill." The following is an excerpt from Private Gibson's personal recollections of the events that followed. "Resting my rifle on top of the wagon box, I began firing with the rest. The whole plain was alive with Indians, all mounted and visible in every direction. They were riding madly about and shooting at us with guns, bows, and arrows, first on one side and then on another of the corral. Then they would circle, and each time coming in closer, uttering the most piercing and unearthly war cries. Some of the most venturesome would ride in close and throw spears at us, and others, still more daring, would ride in within 100 yards and then suddenly drop off one side of their ponies, and all we could see would be an arm or a leg sticking up above the pony's back, and whiz would come their arrows. They paid dearly for their daring, for we had steady rests for our rifles, and the Indians were all within easy point-blank range, and we simply mowed them down by scores. The tops of the wagon beds were literally ripped and torn to slivers by bullets. How we ever escaped with such a slight loss I have never been able to understand. After we had commenced firing, a great number of Indians rode in very close, probably within 150 yards, and sitting on their ponies, waited for us to draw ramrods for reloading, as they supposed we were yet using old muzzle loaders. But, thanks to God and Lieutenant General Sherman, the latter had listened to the appeals of Colonel Carrington, the commander of Fort Phil Kearny the previous year, and we had just been armed with a new weapon. And instead of drawing ramrods and thus losing precious time, we simply threw open the breech locks of our new rifles to eject the empty shell and slapped in fresh ones. This puzzled the Indians, and they were soon glad to withdraw to a safe distance. Though the attacking Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors are indeed incensed at the intruding Americans' incursions into their lands, the American soldiers and civilians fighting from behind the wagon boxes are themselves angered. Though they have all felt a sickening dread at the thought of being caught alive by these mighty warriors of the northern plains, Most have also burned for revenge against those who had tormented and so cruelly dispatched their friends and comrades at the Fetterman Massacre the year prior. Also, most prominent in many of the men's minds is the fact that a mere 6 miles away, at Fort Phil Kearny, are many of the men's wives and children who will be the next target in line should they fail to repulse the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho here. Meanwhile, the attacking warriors now do their best to rescue their comrades, who are wounded, but still alive, out on the coverless open ground in front of the wagon box fort. The sheer daring of their ventures sparks feelings of admiration in their adversaries, even in the heat of the dreadful fight. Continuing from Private Gibson's account, after recovering a great number of their dead and wounded at a fearful sacrifice of life, the Indians withdrew to a safe distance. But while recovering their injured, we witnessed the most magnificent display of horsemanship imaginable. 2 mounted Indians would ride one on each side of the wounded savage, reach over and pick him up on the run, and carry him to a place of safety. This was done many times, and we could not help but admire their courage and daring. During this relative lull in the action, the men scrambled to resupply themselves with ammunition, literally crawling on their hands and feet to the ammunition boxes in order to procure themselves more cartridges. Some of the men take on these resupply duties, while others continue to fire at the wounded warriors and their rescuers. At the same time, on the bluffs to the east and west of their position, 2 parties of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors are trading flashes from small signal mirrors, determining their next move. Gibson's account continues. We did not know what to expect, but we knew that they would soon attack us again. Something desperate had been determined upon by the savages. All we could do was wait and watch. Not a word was spoken. It was a moment of suspense that was simply terrible. As we sat and waited for what we thought would be the finish of us, I looked along the wagon beds and saw my comrades sitting there watching the assembling Indians. Every man had his jaws firmly closed, with a grim determination to fight until we were overpowered. We did not know what time it was, and nobody cared. The fight had commenced about 7 o'clock in the morning, and I did not hear any man ask about the time of day during the fight. Nearly all of us were bareheaded, as we used our caps and hats to hold ammunition. The sun beat down with a pitiless glare that terrible August day, and it seemed like an eternity to us all. Suddenly, someone on the north side of the corral yelled, "Look out! They're coming again!" A cry goes out amongst the men in the wagon box fort. The line of tents had, thus far, presented a significant problem in firing upon the charging warriors, as they blocked the view of the defenders until the warriors came around their edges. Now, seeing one last chance to improve their odds before the next attack, several of the defenders, including Gibson, hurriedly take down as many of the canvas structures as they can before being called back by their officers. Again, from Gibson's account. With the tents down, we could see the Indians to much better advantage, and were enabled to deliver a more effective fire. The whole plain was again alive with countless swarms of the warriors, assembling for another grand charge upon us. Our fire was terribly destructive and deadly in accuracy, and we repulsed them again, but our gun barrels were so overheated from the rapidity of our fire that the metal burned our hands, and we were obliged to open the breech blocks during this lull to allow the barrels to cool off. During one of these momentary lulls, Grady asked me to go out for more ammunition. I crawled out of the wagon box westward and saw several other men after more ammunition, and as I looked towards the west end, I saw the body of Lieutenant Jeunesse, shot through the head and heart. Within a few feet of the corpse, Private Jim Condon was fighting between a barrel of beans placed in between the interval of Captain Powell's wagon bed and the one wagon with the cover on. Horrified, Gibson crawls back to his wagon with the ammunition and informs the others that Lieutenant Jeunesse has been killed. "Good God," the men exclaim. "Anyone else?" Gibson replies that he does not know, and amidst the men's terror, grief, and confusion, they must now keep up their fire against their attackers, young men of often similar ages to them, and themselves in deep states of grief and rage at the loss of their own friends and comrades. Gibson's account continues. About this time, word passed around that Privates Henry Haggerty and Tommy Doyle had been killed on the north side of the corral. The brave little Jerseyman, Haggerty, had been shot through the left shoulder earlier in the fight, but the fact had been kept secret by the other men in the wagon bed, lest some other man become disheartened. The men in the wagon box with Haggerty wanted him to lie down after getting shot through the shoulder, but with his left arm hanging useless at his side, he had used his good right and kept on loading and firing for over 2 hours, until the Indians on the north ridge finally killed him by sending a bullet through the top of his head. Doyle had been killed sometime after the first charge, while bravely fighting behind a breastwork of ox yokes. He was struck in the forehead. In addition to the casualties, water is now running low as well. Cries for water resound inside the confines of the wagon box fort, and just when it seems like the plight of the thirst-stricken men cannot possibly become worse, the native warriors begin to rain down arrows with flaming tips into the fort, catching fire to the dry grass and manure pile used as fire fuel. One of the water barrels lies roughly 20 feet outside the west end of the corral, and is now nearly empty after being perforated by numerous bullet holes. However, when it seems like all hope is lost for the thirst-stricken men, the camp's cook, a man referred to as Mr. Brown in Gibson's memoirs, informs the men of 2 of the camp's coffee pots, which had been filled early in the morning, but he had not yet had time to boil. The coffee pots are, however, precariously located underneath the camp's chuck wagon, a few yards outside the ad hoc fort's walls. Gibson and another man named Johnny Grady volunteer to make a scramble for the water, and with the covering fire of their cohorts on the northern wall, they are able to secure both coffee pots, albeit so narrowly that one pot is hit and largely drained by a native warrior's bullet. Now, another lull in the attacks drags on, taking its toll on the defenders inside the wagon box fort, both mentally and physically. Returning again to Gibson's account. The time between each charge dragged heavily, and the days seemed almost endless. Yet the Indians on the north side of us, hidden under the ridge, kept us constantly on the alert, and some of them on the east ridge, about 200 yards from the east side of the corral, would run out towards us once in a while, armed with spears and tomahawks, each carrying a big shield made of buffalo hide. There they would brandish their weapons in a menacing manner and utter shrill war cries. There was one big giant of an Indian who had thus run out several times from the ridge to the east, and he always managed to escape our fire, until he apparently thought he bore a charmed life and that we could not kill him. He had led all the previous charges from the east end of the ridge and must have been a sub-chief. The last time he appeared must have been at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and this time he came out slowly but grandly, with his big buffalo shield in front of him, brandishing his spear and chanting a war song. Then he would hold his shield on one side and run toward us, jumping into the air and alternating this movement by dodging to one side. The sight was fascinating, and we could not but admire this superb courage. Several of us had fired at him, but without effect, when one of the boys at the east end remarked, "We have simply got to get that fellow, as he thinks we can't hit him." We carefully adjusted our sights, taking accurate aim, and just as he shifted his shield aside and began running towards us, we fired together, and he leaped into the air and came down limp as a rag, fairly riddled with bullets. We all breathed easier after this warrior was killed, for his death seemed to put a stop to any more charges from that direction. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho again draw back, again momentarily content to take pot shots at the men in the wagon box fort, but avoiding major charges. By Gibson's account, Red Cloud is indeed present, and commanding the battle from atop a ridge to the east of the wagon boxes, where the largest congregation of warriors are presently coalesced. We could plainly hear him or some other chief haranguing them in a loud voice. Presently, a great number of Indians rode down the Big Piney Valley out of sight. Another party, several hundred in number, rode out on the plain toward us, evidently for another charge. We all knew that they had lost scores of their braves in killed and wounded, and their maddened frenzy would make another attempt to overwhelm us by force of superior numbers, and they would take a horrible revenge on us if they captured us. It must have been after 3 in the afternoon when, straining our eyes for sight of that line of skirmishers in the glorious blue uniform, meaning the reinforcements, we could distinctly hear a sort of humming sound, seemingly made by many voices, below us in the Big Piney Valley. Some of us thought it was the squaws wailing over their dead warriors, and as the sound grew louder, some of the men on the north side of the corral rose to their feet to see if they could discern anything below them in the Big Piney Valley. But they had no sooner risen to their feet than the others yelled at them, "Down, down, down, or you will get hit." As we waited in the silent wonderment of this strange sound, unlike anything we had ever heard before, the echo appeared to come from the northwest of the corral. The Indians to the east and south of us had come out on the plain, where they were circling and coming nearer all the time, brandishing their spears and war clubs at us, and giving voice to their war cries. Those of the warriors who were armed with guns immediately opened fire again upon us, and we at once replied, killing and wounding many more of them. During this time, that awful humming chanting sound grew in volume and intensity, coming nearer and nearer, now directly west of us. The Indians to the south had withdrawn off the range and seemed to be waiting for something to happen. Then, something happens. A cry comes out from the west side of the wagon box. "Here they come!" as yet another charge of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors cascades down upon the defenders. Suddenly, a sight appears that, according to Gibson, no one present will live to forget. His account continues. "It chilled my blood at the time. We saw hundreds upon hundreds of Indians swarming up a ravine about 90 yards to the west of the corral. They were all on foot, formed to the shape of a letter V, or wedge, and were led by Red Cloud's nephew, who wore a gorgeous war bonnet. Immediately, we opened a terrific fire upon them, under which nothing could stand, and at the first volley Red Cloud's nephew fell, pierced by many bullets. Nothing daunted, the forces came on slowly, and in great numbers, the places of those who fell under our fire being taken immediately by others. So close were the Indian hordes by this time that the heavy rifle bullets from our guns must have gone through 2 or 3 bodies. They were soon so near us that we could even see the whites in their eyes. As they swarmed toward us with the shrill cries and piercing whoops, Private Jim Condon jumped to his feet from behind his barrel of beans and shouted, as he waved his rifle over his head, 'Come on, you blathering sons of guns. We can lick the whole damn bunch of yous.' Captain Powell, who was close by Condon, at once ordered him to lie down. Despite Condon's challenge, or perhaps partly in response to it, the dogged onslaught of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors continues until they are merely yards away from the wagon boxes. At this point, the men inside the confines of the ad hoc fort opened fire yet again falling warriors by the dozens. Gibson's account continues. Our fire was accurate, coolly delivered, and given with most telling effect, but nevertheless it looked for a minute as though our last moment on earth had come. Just when it seemed as if all hope was gone, the Indians suddenly broke and fled. They could not stand before the withering fire we poured into their ranks. The several hundred mounted Indians on the plain south of us, who were intently watching this foot charge, never offered to assist their red brothers by making a mounted charge, but discreetly remained out of rifle range. According to Gibson, Red Cloud himself continues to survey the battle from the ridge to the east. Gibson and several others made shots at the party situated on the ridge, even claiming to have killed some, but no substantiation for this action beyond Gibson's memoirs can be ascertained. Suddenly, much to the confusion of the defenders, the warriors on the eastern ridge begin to break off, riding out of sight in groups of 2s, 3s, and 4s. Seeing this, their foot-bound comrades also retreat. The men in the wagon box fort are momentarily unsure of the cause until they, too, hear the resounding roar of the howitzer field cannons now being utilized against the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho by the U.S. Army forces en route to reinforce the wagon box defenders. No native plan of attack in history involved the purposeful loss of warriors in order to hold strategic ground, and with this in mind, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho depart onto the plains, almost as suddenly as they have appeared. In their stead, scant minutes later, are the silhouettes of their reinforcements, eliciting all manner of reactions from the overjoyed defenders. We all jumped to our feet and yelled. We threw our caps in the air. We hugged each other in the ecstasy of our joy. We cried, laughed, and fairly sobbed like little children in the delirium of our delight. The awful strain was over. The bodies of Lieutenant Jeunesse, Private Doyle, and Private Haggerty are laid with great care in the field ambulances brought by the reinforcements. Captain Powell is informed that they are shocked to find any survivors at all. The survivors make their way back to Fort Phil Kearny, eyes still wide and nerves at the ready, the entirety of the 6-mile trek. Gibson would go on to a long career in the Army, but for himself and the men who had survived this hellish day, this fight that would come to be known to history as the Wagon Box Fight would mark their most trying day. I have served in the Army 48 years, taken active part in the Sioux Campaign of 1876 and also in the Wounded Knee Campaign of 1890-91 at Pine Ridge Agency. But never before or since have my nerves ever been put to the test they sustained on that terrible 2nd of August 1867, when we fought Red Cloud's warriors in the Wagon Box Corral. For Red Cloud, as well as the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the Wagon Box Fight would spell the beginning of the end. Despite his tactical and strategic brilliance, the Americans' weaponry and sheer numbers are beginning to take an irreparable toll on all the Plains tribes. Within a few decades, the way of life for the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho that they had come to know and love so deeply would be brought to an end after decades of brutal conflict. But though the end may be in sight for Red Cloud and his warriors, their story is not yet over. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, though they will scarcely if ever see this level of military success again, have plenty of ire left for the intruders coming to take their lands. It will be many years before anything like peace will be seen on the northern plains. Years replete with bloodshed and atrocities committed on both sides. But the stories of those battles, war crimes, and other tragedies are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Montana, late July, 1867. In the oppressive heat of a large buffalo hide lodge, a group of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors and chiefs beat a large war drum and chant their war songs with all the gusto they could muster as their energy wanes after hours spent at their task. Around them are packed dozens of other warriors, making an already unseasonably warm day nearly unbearable inside the cramped confines of the lodge. The smell of smoke and sweat permeate the air. In the middle of the lodge, circling the center, are a group of several young warriors, all with the skin of their chests pierced on either side by thick leather cordage. Thoroughly exhausted from hours of dancing, chanting, and blood loss, the warriors occasionally suspend the entirety of their body weight from the cordage, stretching every sinew to its absolute limit in their pursuit of spiritual favor. To an unsuspecting bystander, the macabre scene would seem a bizarre, if not repulsive stunt, perhaps akin to some kind of Old West avant-garde performance art. But to the assembled warriors, the matter at hand is a deeply spiritual and critically necessary endeavor in the fate of their peoples. Their intent is to both curry favor with their Great Spirit and to, at least in some sense, divine that Spirit's intentions. This they did through the incitement of visions, be that through fasting, dancing, chanting, or some combination therein. Though their wounds will all, generally, be superficial, the sight and stench of gore do indeed present a nearly overwhelming spectacle. But the ceremony is meant to be gruesome, for they are nations at war, and as the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho are all too aware, war is a gruesome business. Now that the white man's great war in the East has seemingly finished, the Bluecoats are again invading the areas they had sworn not to a decade and a half earlier. Though the United States government had agreed to terms with the tribes in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, the advent of mass westward expansion after the Civil War has necessitated greater and greater incursions into that territory that, by law, is not theirs. The year prior, the legendary Sioux chief Red Cloud had begun to wage a campaign of tactical and strategic brilliance against the U.S. Army in their attempts to both escort settlers as well as man the system of forts they had constructed throughout the plains. On December 21st of 1866, though he was not present at the battle due to a wound suffered on a raid against the Sioux's hated enemy, the Crow, Red Cloud's forces had destroyed a large contingent of U.S. cavalry soldiers under the command of Captain William J. Fetterman. The resulting defeat was the most costly suffered by the United States Army on the plains until a full decade later at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The force of roughly 1,000 warriors, which included future legends such as Crazy Horse and American Horse, laid waste to every single member of the 81-man patrol in desperate, bloody, hand-to-hand combat. As was custom in Northern Plains warfare, as both a deterrent and a punishment, the bodies of the slain had been horribly mutilated and left for their comrades to find. Colonel Henry B. Carrington, the commanding officer of the fort during the Fetterman Massacre, led a contingent of cavalry troops out to find the remains of the fallen the day after the fight. Carrington's account of what he and his troops found could be descriptive of the aftermath of countless encounters between U.S. troops and native tribes on the open plains. We found their eyes torn out and laid on rocks, noses cut off, ears cut off, chins hewn off, entrails taken out and exposed, hands cut off, feet cut off, arms taken out from socket, private parts severed and indecently placed on the person. Such viscerally disturbing sights would forever haunt the dreams of those who had been present that day, and endured the gory task of burying the brutalized remains of their comrades in the icy, hard ground of the Wyoming frontier. A heroic ride had been made by one Manuel Felipe Cardozo, also known as John Phillips or Portuguese Phillips, in the midst of a blizzard from Fort Phil Kearny to Fort Laramie, where the commanding officer, Colonel Innes Palmer, was informed of the defeat and reinforcements were marshaled. But while such tragic losses were avoided by the Army during the spring and vast majority of the summer, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had continued to harass travelers on the Bozeman Trail, as well as civilian woodcutting and hay-gathering details that had served as critical support lifelines for the fort. Now, as the summer season for hunting and making war comes into full swing, the tribes gathered here at the Sundance on the sweltering Montana plains intend to divine their next target with the help of both their Great Spirit and the direction of the war chief who has so brilliantly led them in the preceding months, Red Cloud. Now, it is determined that the next focal point of their ire will be the civilian work details of Fort C.F. Smith and Fort Phil Kearny. In classic guerrilla warfare strategy, Red Cloud intends not to attack the strongholds of the fort, but rather to strike at their most vulnerable elements when and where they present themselves as targets. It is determined that, in just a few weeks' time, the warriors of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho now gathered here for the Sundance will resume their terrorizing of the U.S. Army forts, and they will not stop until the U.S. Army and all the white men are gone from their territory for good. On the morning of August 1st, 1867, the warriors rise hours before dawn to complete their pre-raid rituals. Horses and bodies are painted, weapons are checked and rechecked, prayers are offered, and water is consumed nearly to the point of nauseation in preparation for the long, hot day ahead. Miles away, just as dawn begins to break, the soldiers and civilians ensconced within the walls of Fort C.F. Smith are busy readying themselves for another day of hard labor in the unremitting summer heat. As the inhabitants of the fort hurriedly consume breakfasts of hardtack and black coffee, they nervously eye the rolling countryside outside of the fort's walls. In the hue of the new dawn glow, the scene is sparse, beautiful, and deceptively placid. But as they make small talk and finish their breakfasts, every man knows that a very real danger lies out there, somewhere on the open plains. However, the option to simply hunker down inside the walls of the fort, enticing as it might seem, is not a tenable one. Should the civilian laborers not venture forth to cut and gather the hay that sustains the livestock within the fort, their means of both sustenance and mobility will be markedly compromised. And so, just after sunrise, a group of 30 men, composed of 21 soldiers and 9 civilians, make its nerve-rattling 2.5-mile commute to the Hayfield in the Bigfoot Valley, where their day's work of harvesting lays ahead of them. As the laborers set about their work, the soldiers take their places on guard. The soldiers, members of the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry and under the command of Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg, split their force of 21 men between the hilltops surrounding the Hayfield and the improvised corral-turned-fort that is to serve as shelter for the soldiers and civilians alike should an attack occur. The fort, more aptly described by one source as a fortified corral, has been constructed on the left bank of War Man Creek, roughly 40 feet from the stream bed. It measures roughly 100 feet by 60 feet and consists of upright posts sunk into the ground at 6-foot intervals. Horizontally attached to these are heavy poles, tied off to the vertical poles and interlaced with green willow branches. At best, under actual duress, the fortification will provide little in the way of cover, but it is certainly better than the alternative of being caught in the open. Though undeniably unnerved by the austerity and peril of their current location, the haycutters are still motivated by the repressive heat of the day that will soon become their second most formidable enemy. Thus, they are making a concerted effort to cut as much of the waist-high grass as possible, using mule-drawn hay mowers popularized in the last few decades. Suddenly, the plodding of the mules, the calls of the drivers, and the burring of the cutting blades are drowned out by the sound of gunfire and the cries of the guards stationed on the hilltops. As the soldiers call out to their cohorts in the fort and make their way frantically to the confines of the ad hoc structure, the laborers in the field are unable to fully discern what they are saying, but the meaning behind their actions is instantly all too clear. Native warriors have been spotted, and presumably in large numbers due to the panic of the rapidly retreating soldiers, and now every one of them are in very real danger. The men in the field drop their harvesting tools and make a sprint for the confines of the wooden-walled fort. As they run, they repeatedly look over their shoulders to what is a sight perhaps even more frightful than they had initially imagined. A large force of anywhere between 500 to 800 Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors now floods over the ridges of the surrounding hilltops in a veritable torrent of humanity and horseflesh. As the warriors rumble towards them, their bright war paint, feathers, gleaming weapons, and piercing cries present a sight that has haunted virtually all of the Americans' nightmares for weeks now. They had, time and again, heard the bone-chilling accounts of those soldiers who had found the unfortunate remains of the dead at the site of the Fetterman Massacre, and had, to a man, often wondered if they might suffer the same fate themselves. But now, of course, the spectacle before them presents a very immediate and very mortal threat. Before many of the Americans, both soldiers and civilians, can join their comrades already defending the fort, some of the charging Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho are able to flank the fort from the side opposite the Hayfield, even managing to occupy some of the rifle pits dug just outside the hastily constructed walls. From behind these walls, the defenders fight ferociously, firing off an initial volley from their new Springfield Model 1866 trapdoor rifles. This new loading system, as opposed to the previous practice of loading the weapon through the muzzle, allows the soldiers to fire up to 15 to 20 rounds per minute, roughly 5 to 6 times the firing rate of their previous weapons. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, however, have no idea that this advantage exists. Their strategy, as the attacking force, is to endure the first volley and to, after incurring any initial losses, eventually isolate and overwhelm this group of trespassers, just as they had done to the command of Captain Fetterman and countless others in the preceding months. But the initial volley cuts the charge into 2 separate advancing sections, with one group approaching from the west and the other from the east. And now, a pitched battle ensues, with the charging warriors pouring arrows into the confines of the fortified corral, all while exhorting their war cries in an effort that at times overtakes the cacophonous roar of the Springfield rifles. The first minutes of the battle unfold in rapid succession, in a mix of chaos and confusion, as the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho war chiefs urge on their younger cohorts, and Lieutenant Sternberg steadfastly takes his position, standing over his men who now lie prone and firing as he calmly encourages them and directs their fire. The veteran of several engagements, Sternberg refuses to take cover and fires his revolver while standing, fully exposed to the enemy. While this action is clearly brave, it is also exceedingly ill-advised in high plains warfare, and within minutes, the 30-year-old lieutenant falls dead from a shot to the head from one of the attacking warriors. Seeing the dire nature of the situation rapidly growing worse with the loss of their formal leadership, a civilian named Don A. Colvin now takes charge, directing the young soldiers not to follow their lieutenant's example, but to continue their rate of resolute fire from behind any and all cover they can procure. Another soldier, a private named Nairn, is also shot and killed by the attacking warriors. Eventually, though, the initial attack is driven back. Now, as the main force of warriors withdraws to coalesce and recalibrate, several individual warriors take up positions amongst the willows in the creek, from where they incessantly pepper the soldiers with pot shots. For the remainder of the morning and into the afternoon, the two sides trade shots, doing little in the way of consequential damage, but making retreat to Fort C.F. Smith virtually impossible. As the day drags on, consternation amongst both soldier and civilian pinned down inside the Hayfort begins to grow. For reasons that will never be made explicitly clear, no relief force has yet been mounted from Fort C.F. Smith in order to aid their comrades in distress. Many worry that they will die here, in this barren hayfield so far from their homes. Others worry that worse, they will be taken captive and made to suffer the same fate as that of Fetterman's men the previous winter. Meanwhile, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, although having killed the opposing commander, are themselves reeling. Several have been killed in the initial charge, and all are dismayed by the capabilities of the soldiers' new rapid-fire weapons. The decision is now made that if the warriors cannot wrest the soldiers from their defensive works in a head-on charge, they will set fire to the wooden confines and smoke them out. Soon, the soldiers lying prone behind what little cover the wooden railing and lattice work provides are made aware that their brief respite from the fight is over by way of dozens of flaming arrows falling about the dried grass that surrounds the fort. Behind the screen of smoke and flames, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors make daring charges forward in order to rescue their fallen comrades and recover their dead. One Private Lockhart, a young soldier defending the fort, gives the following first-hand account. Fire came in rolling billows, like the waves of the ocean, the Indians whooping behind. When it arrived within 20 feet of the barricade, it stopped, as though arrested by a supernatural power. The flames arose to a perpendicular height of at least 40 feet, made one or two undulating movements, and were extinguished with a spanking slap. The wind, the succeeding instant, carried the smoke of the smoldering grass from the providentially saved encampment. After an initial charge in order to recover their comrades, the native warriors again make a vicious attack on the fort itself, raining down bullets and arrows upon the defenders while again taking significant casualties themselves. However, in this attack, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho managed to mortally wound J.G. Hollister and inflict another wound on Sergeant Norton. Again, the battle devolves into a sniping match, with each side reluctant to make any major move. As the scorching summer sun reaches its noontime apex, both factions are exhausted from both the heat and the intensity of combat. A momentary lull in fighting occurs, with each side seizing the opportunity to stock up on water and tend to their wounded. As they wait on yet another attack they are all but certain will soon come, the soldiers and civilians ensconced inside the Hayfield fort dig into their positions, and each man ensures he is amply supplied with both water and ammunition. Soon, another charge comes. Again, the blood-curdling war cries of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fill the air, as the brave warriors make yet another charge, in hopes of finally overrunning the Hayfield fort. But this time, the defenders, now with their more entrenched positions and with a boost in their collective morale from being able to restock their drinking water, offer up their most vociferous defense yet. Their repeating rifles are again able to inflict significant damage on the attacking warriors. Their first attack after the lull in fighting is repulsed, but the warriors soon regroup and make yet another charge. On this second charge, George Duncan manages to gravely wound a charging warrior. This warrior's fall alone seems to bring the entire attacking force to a near instantaneous halt. The attacking warriors now retreat, scooping up their wounded comrade on their egress, and again disappearing over the hilltops. It is speculated amongst the defenders that perhaps the attacking warrior is a medicine man or chief. Perhaps, they hope, that will be the last attack of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. Their own ammunition is beginning to run low, and the lack of reinforcements is again beginning to dampen their hopes of escape. Unwilling to hedge their bets on the native warriors having retreated for good, though, civilian Colvin leads an effort to reinforce the southern wall of the Hayfield fort. The defenders are again met with the sight of an oncoming horde of mighty native warriors, themselves exhausted, incensed, and fearful. This time, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho attack on foot, making a mad dash from the south towards the newly reinforced wall. The cry goes out amongst the men defending the Hayfield fort to hold their fire until the attacking force has crossed the river and fully made their way out of the brush and into the open few yards of territory between the river and the southern wall of the fort. Finally, civilian Colvin opens fire, soon followed by the rest of the defenders, who in turn follow their shots with reloading and firing in rapid succession. Again, what is believed by the men in the fort to be a chief is killed in one of the volleys. Several of his warrior cohorts also fall, most dead or mortally wounded. The desperate attack is quickly repulsed, and seeing an opening in the weakened Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces, Private Bradley volunteers to take one of the 3 mules that had survived the fight and make a ride to CF Fort to make a desperate plea for reinforcements. With several warriors trailing him the entire way, Private Bradley miraculously makes his way into the confines of Fort C.F. Smith, with his attackers only several dozen yards behind him. When he arrives, he is informed that Company G, under the command of Colonel Bradley, no relation, has just moved out in order to reinforce the men at the Hayfield Fort. Learning of the full severity of the situation at the Hayfield Fort, a Company H, under the command of Lieutenant Fenton, is ordered to reinforce Company G, taking with them one of the fort's mountain howitzers, a small but formidable field cannon. The reinforcements reach the Hayfield fort just as the sun is beginning to set. On their way into the fort, they had fought the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho with intermittent skirmishing and potshots. Now, as the officers take stock of the gruesome scene of dead, wounded, and traumatized men, the men continue to snipe with warriors hidden in the brush line across the riverbank. With darkness looming, the need is rapidly becoming imminent to move back to Fort C.F. Smith, lest they all be trapped here overnight. Of the 22 mules that had made their way to the Hayfield fort that morning, only 3 remain alive. This means that only 2 of the wagons at the Hayfield fort can be used to transport the dead and wounded back to Fort C.F. Smith. Finally, after the wagons are loaded and the wounded are made ready to move, Lieutenant Colonel Brown orders a mountain howitzer brought forth, and the remaining warriors are soon scattered with a few powerful blasts from the short-barreled artillery weapon with a notoriously cacophonous roar. The retreating force now makes their way back to Fort C.F. Smith, still skirmishing and taking potshots at warriors hidden in the brush and rolling hills. At one point in the 2-mile trek, the mountain howitzer is again made ready and fired upon pursuing warriors spotted on a bluff. Finally, at roughly 8:30 p.m., the rescue force, as well as the Hayfield Fort defenders, make their way back into the confines of Fort C.F. Smith. For the men at Fort C.F. Smith, their long, difficult, deadly day is over. 3 amongst their ranks, Lieutenant Sternberg, Private Navin, and J.G. Hollister, have been killed, and several more are wounded. But now, finally safe in the confines of the fort, the men can breathe a sigh of long-awaited relief. For the men at this remote post in Montana, it seems as though the whole world has been condensed into the area between their present location and the Hayfield fort. As each man finally falls asleep that night, they are thankful that their fighting, at least for now, is done. But the very next day, on August 2nd, 1867, another contingent of civilian laborers and soldiers on a work detail roughly 80 miles away at Fort Phil Kearny in Wyoming will fight for their lives against perhaps an even larger, more desperate force of attacking Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors in what will be the last major engagement of Red Cloud's War. It will be known to history as the Wagon Box Fight, and seen in many records as an inseparable event from the Hayfield fight. However, the story of the Wagon Box Fight and the conclusion of Red Cloud's War are other stories for other times. June 25th, 1876, early afternoon, in what is today's southern Montana. On the banks of what is known to them as the Greasy Grass River, a large camp of Lakota and Cheyenne milled about their village, ensconced in their daily routine of chores and recreation. Many of the young warriors were just now waking up, exhausted after a long night of ribald celebration and dancing. Children swam in the river, women tended campfires, and young men tended to the large horse herds that belonged to the camp. This was, in fact, the largest encampment of Plains tribes that would ever be recorded. The Lakota and Cheyenne had come together during this blistering Plains summer with the intent of luring the U.S. Army's cavalry forces into an ambush. The U.S. Army was responsible for enforcing the policies decided upon by the U.S. government, regardless of whether those policies were consistent with treaties signed and promises made to native tribes from Florida to the Pacific Northwest. The U.S. Army's cavalry were the most commonly encountered by the Plains tribes, as they were the only forces capable of locating, pursuing, and engaging horseback warriors on the vast expanse of the open plains. The Bluecoats, as they were colloquially known amongst the Plains tribes, had inflicted not only costly defeats, but committed a number of what could only be termed as massacres amongst many tribes, including the Lakota and the Cheyenne. But they had also been on the receiving end of horrific violence that had at times rivaled or surpassed the ferocity that many of these soldiers had experienced during the Civil War. They were commanded by men who had cut their teeth in some of the Civil War's most ferocious battles, men like Captain Frederick Benteen, Major Marcus Reno, and General George Armstrong Custer. Most of the men, though, were relative neophytes to Plains warfare, and many of them were relatively recent immigrants who now found themselves fighting for their lives in austere outposts against an enemy who often appeared out of nowhere, killed with an extreme prejudice, mutilated the dead in horribly macabre ways, and disappeared just as quickly. The army had been sweeping the northern plains for years, attempting to bring the plains tribes to bear. But they had struggled for decades, as fighting such a decentralized enemy posed problems that the officers trained in classic Napoleonic warfare struggled to address successfully. On this day, though, the large encampment of Lakota and Cheyenne felt there was little to no chance of running into the Bluecoats. They assumed their enemy was near, but most of the war chiefs had agreed it would be days yet before their marshaled forces would have an opportunity to be brought to bear against their incessant harassers. In this expansive 2-mile encampment, home to anywhere from 6,000 to 10,000 Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, most of the inhabitants felt safe, at ease, and perfectly content to enjoy the day. But one among them sat pensively in his lodge. He had a bad feeling. He had hardly slept the night before, as he had been convinced that a morning attack from the cavalry was imminent. The light of dawn had proven his prophecy not wholly correct, but he still had a feeling that something was not right, that the Bluecoats were not, in fact, that far away at all. He had grown up the product of an interband relationship, his father being an Oglala and his mother being from the Miniconjou band. He had been known as Curly as a boy. That was his name when, at the age of 14, he went on a vision quest into the Black Hills of the Dakotas. For 3 days and nights he fasted, until a spirit appeared to him in a vision. He was told that his life from that point forward must be dedicated to the welfare of his people. He was told that he would be a great warrior and that no bullet nor arrow would kill him. He was also told that he would die a martyr's death at the hands of the Bluecoats. He returned to his village and embarked on his career as a vaunted warrior. That, though, had been many years ago. Though he was now married, his face was scarred from the bullet that had torn into it years earlier when the jealous husband of Black Buffalo Woman had discovered them after they had eloped from the village. She was the true love of his life, and though they had been forced apart, the scar was a constant reminder of a love lost. In the interim between this summer day in 1876 and his vision quest some 2 decades earlier, the young warrior had built himself into a venerable fighter, and then into a trusted leader. Though his personal indiscretions with married women had cost him the title of chief, this seemed a matter of mere formality. He was a war chief, and his name inspired awe in his compatriots and terror in his enemies. He was the veritable puzzle wrapped in an enigma, wrapped in a riddle. He was known to his people as Tashanka Witko, but history knows him as Crazy Horse. And while Crazy Horse's prediction would prove to be slightly askew in terms of timing, his intuition about a large battle coming that day would prove correct. Today, he and his Plains warrior cohorts would take part in the largest battle in Plains warfare history, and they would all but annihilate their hated enemies, the Bluecoats. However, as momentous as the occasion would prove to be, it started with some of the village spotted a dust cloud. This was the result of the 7th Cavalry's engagement with a Lakota camped down the river. During this engagement, 2 cavalrymen had their mounts spooked so badly by the gunfire, bugle calls, and screams that they bolted from the battlefield, their hapless riders captive to their fight or flight instincts. Unfortunately for these men, their horses bolted straight for Crazy Horse's encampment. They were met by startled Lakota whose initial disbelief gave way to rage-soaked indignity. The 2 soldiers were quickly yanked off their mounts and promptly clubbed and stabbed to death as they pled for mercy. Word soon reached Crazy Horse that the cavalry was attacking. Seemingly unsurprised and perhaps even slightly indignant, the veteran warrior called for his war ponies to be gathered and brought to his lodge. He then painstakingly applied his war paint, covering his upper body in yellow pigment and drawing a singular lightning bolt down the left side of his face. He secured the lone feather he wore in his hair, as opposed to the flowing war bonnets favored by so many of his fellow warriors. As he readied himself, the younger warriors, Those who had not heeded his warnings and danced into the wee hours of the morning began to hem and haw. They must attack now, they protested, before the fighting was over and there were no more trophies to be taken, nor honor to be won. But Crazy Horse remained unmoved. Finally, Crazy Horse's war mounts were brought to his lodge. After an excruciatingly long wait for the younger warriors, Crazy Horse emerged from his lodge. He selected a war horse, mounted it, and began to ride out of the village, a large throng of warriors in tow. They headed first to a ridgeline where Major Reno was attempting to ensconce himself and his men, including his Crow scouts, in a patch of timber in hopes of securing a workable defensive position. With the arrival of Crazy Horse and his contingent of warriors, the attack on Reno's element reached unbearable levels for his men. First, Reno's favorite Crow scout was killed only feet away from him, leaving him covered in the scout's brains and blood. As the Lakota swirled around the cavalrymen, and arrows and bullets poured in from every direction, all hope seemed lost. Unable to endure the terror any longer, a number of troops attempted to flee. Crazy Horse rode among the desperate troopers, methodically clubbing them down one by one. Some soldiers were so panicked they could not muster their legs to run, but only walk as they furiously pumped their arms. Some soldiers attempted to stop running, turn around, and beg their Lakota adversaries to show them mercy and to take them prisoner. All were promptly brained by war clubs or cut down in a hail of bullets and arrows. Reno and a number of his command would survive, but only due to Custer and his isolated contingent of men presenting a more enticing target and a more immediate threat. Custer had become desperate in the relentless onslaught that was being brought to bear by a native force the size of which he had never imagined. Now, with all hope fading, Custer was making a mad dash towards the heart of the main village in an attempt to sweep through it and apprehend as many women and children as possible, to hold as prisoners, and hopefully to barter their peaceable retreat. This was not as crazy an idea as it may sound to modern ears, as this was a relatively common practice on the plains. However, Custer and his men would never make it to the village. Now, they were stuck fighting on a small hill, in a desperate roving retreat, and Crazy Horse was on his way. Upon arriving at the scene, Crazy Horse observed the field and consulted with his fellow warriors, all while coolly firing off his rifle and killing as many soldiers as possible from atop a small hill. Then, he and his men attacked the right flank of Custer's men, splitting what was left of the small remnant force into two even smaller elements. As the fighting continued, Crazy Horse rode between the two elements of soldiers, blowing his piercingly haunting eagle-bone flute and shouting orders. Despite this nearly suicidal behavior, he remained untouched. By this time, the din of battle had shaken even the 7th Cavalry's war horses. Those that had not been cut down by enemy fire were simply let go as all the survivors left threw themselves down belly first into the grass in an attempt to minimize themselves as targets. This desperate situation lasted only briefly, however, until the air was pierced again by a loud war whistle. This was the signal for the Lakota to mount a massive general charge to finish off Custer and those under his command who remained alive, including Custer's 2 brothers and his teenage nephew. Thousands of warriors swarmed the hill. Custer and his men fired an initial volley that momentarily stalled the attack, but within seconds it had reconvened and swarmed in amongst the cavalrymen, cutting as many down as they could, as some attempted to flee southward. All were summarily cut down within minutes. By the end of the day, every one of the 210 men under Custer's command would lie dead on that hill near the banks of the greasy grass. But, of course, today we know that river as the Little Bighorn, and the battle that took place there as one of the most seminal moments in American history. And, while it was also a seminal moment in Northern Plains tribal history, as it ultimately marked the beginning of the end for their way of life. The U.S. Army, they knew, would be back and would seek vengeance for what had happened there. But for now, there was a great victory to celebrate. The next day, Crazy Horse would be named Commander-in-Chief of the joint forces comprised of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. His legend was solidified, but his prophecy only partially completed. A little over a year later, Crazy Horse would meet his martyr's fate, stabbed in the back by duplicitous soldiers in Fort Robinson, Nebraska. But that, like the plethora of other personal stories and accounts from the Battle of the Little Bighorn, is another story for another time. Texas, March 19th, 1840. Amidst the rolling limestone hills, oak-strewn pastures, and vibrant Texas wildflowers, a contingent of Comanche men, women, and children made their way to the town of San Antonio, under the guidance of their band's most revered war chief, Mugwara, or Spirit Talker. They had come bearing items for trade and were looking forward to a revelrous and hopefully profitable day. They had come, they assumed, to trade for needed wares and to barter their goods. This was not unheard of, nor even altogether uncommon on the Texas frontier. The warfare and bloodshed that was underway in the War for Texas was a far more fluid affair than is often portrayed today. And trading between yesterday's enemy and tomorrow's foe was often as much a matter of convenience as it was necessity. In fact, Spirit Talker himself had strode the line between collegiality and combativeness, between cultures far more frequently and more adeptly than most. In the years prior, he had provided not only shelter to Texas Rangers, his presumed mortal enemy, but had defended them from attack by the neighboring Wacos. On this day, the problem was, as far as the residents of San Antonio were concerned, that the Comanche's wares included not just goods, but a person. A daughter of a San Antonio resident. She and her sister had been kidnapped from their family farm on the Texas frontier 2 years earlier. Her name was Matilda Lockhart. She was 16 years old in 1840, and the last 2 years of her life had been a living nightmare that had seen her kidnapped, sold into slavery, sexual and otherwise, subjected to abuses, sexual and otherwise, humiliation, subjugation, and even mutilation. Not only had she been repeatedly raped and forced to labor under pain of violence, her nose had been burned to her face. The cartilage on her nose had been burned off to the bone on her face. Famed Texas frontier woman Mary Maverick cared for Lockhart upon her arrival in San Antonio and described her experience. She described Miss Lockhart's condition as, quote, utterly degraded and could not hold her head up again. Her head, arms, and face were full of bruises and sores, and her nose actually burnt off to the bone, all the fleshy end gone, and a great scab formed on the end of the bone. Both nostrils were wide open and denuded of flesh. She told a piteous tale, how dreadfully the Indians had beaten her, and how they would wake her from her sleep by sticking a chunk of fire to her flesh, especially to her nose. Her body had many scars from the fire. End quote. There is some dispute among historians as to the entirety of the veracity of Mary Maverick's account, as several preceding accounts of Comanche visitors who had encountered Matilda and a contingent of other white and Mexican women and children who had been kidnapped and made captives and slaves of the band failed to mention such outward and obvious signs of physical torture. However, as conflicting as the accounts may be on this matter, it is safe to say Matilda Lockhart's appearance sparked an outrage in the residents of San Antonio for 2 reasons. One, that she had suffered enough physical abuse for it to be easily visually discernible by all present. And 2, that she was the only captive present. Earlier in the year, General Sidney Albert Johnson had ordered. The problem with this approach, aside from its blank check for bloodshed should its acceptable terms not be reached, was that it presumed that the Comanche had a centralized power structure of chiefs. This was not the case with the Comanche. They were not under one chief. They did not even cede full political power to band headmen outside of the times of war. And even then, the warrior with the most power was the one able to raise the most warriors for his proposed raid or battle against the enemy de jour. The Comanche had no centralized power, and thus could not be negotiated with as a singular entity. This was not only unknown to most whites at the time, it was all but incomprehensible to them. And, even if they did understand it, it made negotiating the return of hostages from the Comanche a daunting, if not impossible, task. Now, on this warm spring day, as the contingent of Comanche composed of unarmed men, women, and children made their way through the mud-laden and refuse-strewn streets of San Antonio, they stopped to pick up pieces of scrap iron to use for arrows and spears. This further confounded the Texans present and added to the overall surreality and awkwardness of the situation. Some residents tried to make nice with the visitors, setting up small targets for the children to shoot with their toy bows and arrows. But as the word spread that there was only one white woman captive present, and that she was terribly disfigured, the collective ire of San Antonio focused on the Comanche that stood in front of them. The commanding military officer present, Colonel William Fisher, summoned the 12 chiefs present to what was known as the Council House, a one-story 18th century stone building in the plaza of the city. In fact, you can still go to this place where this all happened. You can still go there today. It's on the east side of the main plaza in San Antonio behind the Drury Inn. The original building is gone, but there is still a two-story structure where the council house stood. The Comanche chiefs came inside, still assuming that this would be an amiable affair, and took seats on the floor along the wall. The contingent of Texans present, including military and Texas Rangers, stood lining the other three walls, assuming what seemed to be strangely ominous positions to the chiefs present. When all were assembled, Colonel Fisher spoke curtly through a translator to Spirit Talker, who served as a spokesman for his group. The colonel demanded to know where the other captives were and why the chief had not seen fit to honor his prior commitment of returning the white captives under his charge. Spirit Talker, still assuming this entire situation was one big misunderstanding, his tone seemed to vacillate between peaceable and haughty as he took greater and greater offense to the colonel's accusations. But he made no overtly offensive comments or movements, only concluding his explanation with the question, "How do you like that answer?" However sought after Spirit Talker had been in his life until this point as a great speaker and negotiator and a downright likable guy, he fatally misread his audience on this occasion. Colonel Fisher became enraged and stated that he did not like Spirit Talker's answer one bit, and that now Spirit Talker and his cohort of chiefs were under arrest until all of the Texas hostages were returned. Some soldiers moved to block the door, as others moved toward the Comanche chiefs, intending to subdue and handcuff them before transporting them to the San Antonio jail. In these fleeting moments, as the gravity of the situation settled in on Spirit Talker and his cohort of war chiefs, there seemed to be an air of confusion and disbelief. Then, in a flash, the violence started. Spirit Talker pulled a knife he had concealed on his person and stabbed one of the soldiers in the chest as he made a break for the door. The other chiefs all either pulled concealed weapons of their own or attempted to grab the rifles of the soldiers, hoping to either make a break for their lives or sell their lives as dearly as possible. Inside the small room, gunfire erupted, with eardrum-rattling volume and intensity. As smoke filled the room, bodies began to thud to the ground, some dead, some dying, some injured, and some still fighting. Ranger Matthew Caldwell, known as Old Paint because of his terribly sun-mottled skin, took a round to the shin, hit the ground in agony, while still pulling his sidearm and beginning to systematically shoot down any Comanche that he could. The fight spilled quickly outside the doors, as the fleeing chiefs who emerged alive alerted their tribesmen of what was coming. What transpired was an hours-long, city-wide carnival of carnage. The children, who had been shooting at targets with their toy bows and arrows, turned them on live targets, drilling a number of residents with very real arrows, and even killing a district judge by drilling him in the heart with several arrows. He fell dead in the street as the Comanche desperately attempted to fight their way out of San Antonio. The residents, soldiers, and rangers present were now on a house-by-house kill-or-capture mission to bring in as many Comanche as they could and kill any who would not surrender or did not surrender to the Texans' standards. 2 warriors attempted to take refuge in a local home, barricading themselves inside. The Texians set fire to the roof, smoking the Comanches out of the house. As soon as they escaped the door, one was shot down and the other had his head split open with an axe. All the Comanche who were not killed outright were shuffled into the open-roofed jailhouse and placed under arrest. They were told they would be detained until all Texan captives had been returned to San Antonio. One Comanche was given a horse and told to ride back to the camp they had come from to inform the rest of their tribesmen of what had happened, what the new terms were, and that the Texans meant business. The rider made haste northward, over the limestone cliffs and oak meadows, back to the home camp of his band. Upon learning what happened to their friends and relatives, the camp itself erupted into its own torrent of grief, anger, despair, and hate. The wives of the slain chiefs and warriors mutilated themselves, cutting off their hair, slashing their breasts, and cutting off their fingertips. One inflicted such severe wounds on herself that she died of severe blood loss. Then, one by one, starting with Matilda Lockhart's own 6-year-old sister, all the captives who had not been adopted into the tribe were dragged from their tents, stripped naked, and roasted alive over hot Comanche campfires on the dry, sun-soaked Texas plains. They were mocked and taunted as they begged for their lives, not understanding in their last moments that they were the penance for the deeds of their would-be rescuers. After this hours-long ordeal, each and every horse belonging to the dead chiefs and warriors was slaughtered by bashing in its head, shooting it with arrows, or slitting its throat. Thousands of dead horses, as the Comanche had exponentially more than any tribe, soon covered the now blood-soaked plains. For both the Texans and the Comanche, there would be no conciliatory terms offered. Now, this was a war to the end. But this story is just getting started. What the Comanche did next would be warfare the likes of which no tribe had ever seen or been able to accomplish on either scale or ferocity. They were about to take this war all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, and they planned to either kill every Texan they could or drive them into the ocean. But that is a story for another day. August 12th, 1840, near present-day Lockhart, Texas. In the humid, burning dawn so common to Central Texas summers, 24-year-old Nancy Darst Crosby sat dejectedly on the back of an unshod, rough-haired pony. Though her skin was terribly sunburnt and her thighs horribly chafed from days of riding, she said nothing, for it would do no good. All she could do was run the events of the previous few days through her head. She and a number of other captives, mostly women, had been taken during a series of brutal Comanche raids along the South Texas coast. They had watched their loved ones cut down, their homes burned to the ground, and entire populations of their hometowns scattered into the shallow Texas bays to seek refuge from the attack in wooden merchant ships anchored offshore. They had come all the way to Texas relatively recently, most of them from frontier states like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Nancy herself was the granddaughter of legendary frontiersman Daniel Boone. She had settled in South Texas, married, and given birth to a son only a little over a year earlier. A blissful family life seemed all but assured until the Comanche came on that one dreadful day. They had killed her husband and taken her and her baby son captive. The customary Comanche treatment of women's prisoners would be termed inhumane by any measure, with sexual assault being an assumed norm and the outright killing of captives being a matter wholly left to the whims of their captors. Nancy's whalebone corset had prevented the sexual assault, but her baby had been summarily stabbed to death in front of her when she could not quiet the child's screams. One can only imagine what she felt, only days later, as she faced yet another day of ceaseless torment. This party of Comanche, though typical in their tactics, was highly unusual both in the size and scope of the raiding they had committed. They also presented a strikingly unusual visual. Many wore the traditional breechcloths and leggings, with headdresses made of buffalo horns, feathers, wolf's heads, and one even wearing the skin of a sand crane atop his head. They were armed with bows, arrows, 14-foot lances, shields, and a number of pistols and rifles they had procured in trading and raiding. But perhaps the most striking sight in the roving, raiding band was the adornment of its warriors in some of the newest, trendiest fashions of the time. Top hats, new leather boots, blankets, lace, umbrellas, and brass-button coats worn backwards. To top off this bizarre scene, war horses, lances, and shields were all festooned with links of bright red ribbons. The sheer size of this force was also a highly unusual factor that day. Comanche raiding parties usually struck swiftly and scattered immediately after a raid. But this party included the wives and children of the warriors, for this was no ordinary raid. It had started when the Comanche chief Buffalo Hump had awakened one night having seen a vision in his dreams. Only weeks earlier, the Comanche had suffered the loss of many of their greatest war chiefs in what came to be known as the Council House fight. The Comanche had brought in a young captive white girl named Matilda Lockhart in order to trade her surrender for goods and an agreement to the cessation of any more white trespassing. But the horrendously pitiable condition of the young girl caused such an uproar in the city of San Antonio that an arrest was attempted. When that was resisted, the chiefs were shot down. It had been a seminal event in recent Comanche history, and Buffalo Hump and his band of Penateca Comanche had burned for revenge ever since. But it wasn't until Buffalo Hump reported his vision to his people that a plan for revenge began to materialize. In his dream, he had seen the Penateca and their allies, the Kiowas, driving the white intruders into the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Those that they were not able to kill outright were expelled from Texas forever. The victory would be glorious, the spoils innumerable, and the redemption for the Comanche total. And, up until this point, Buffalo Hump had proven all but prophetic. The Comanche raiding party had cut a torrent of violence south from the Texas Hill Country to the coast, and now they were on their return trip. But now, three factors were working against them as they made their way back northwest, back to the limestone and cedar of the hill country. First, the bounty they had fought so brutally to ascertain now became a burden. The weight of the iron cookware, cloth, clothing, firearms, ammunition, food, and other sundries, not to mention their terribly traumatized and physically compromised captives, slowed the party's advancement considerably. Secondly, the Comanche had not only broken their typical practice of scattering after a raid, but were following the same trail to get back home that they had used to make their attacks in the first place. This made them easy for trackers to follow, which was not often the case after native raids. This led us to our third and final problem faced by Buffalo Hump and his sizable contingent. They were now being tracked by the Texas Rangers as well as a number of local militiamen. This made a rapid egress all the more important, yet simultaneously difficult to accomplish. The Rangers, a relatively recently formed force, had thus far presented some of the only consequential resistance to the Comanches in the whole of Texas. They were largely young, violence-hungry men who had come to Texas for the express purpose of tracking, trailing, and killing Comanches. According to several contemporary accounts, at this time, their mortality rate was around 50%. These young men were becoming a sizable thorn in the side of the Comanche, but were simultaneously experiencing a sort of Darwinism via combat in which the weaker and/or more unfortunate among them became weeded out via hard, often torturous deaths at the hands of the Comanche. Nonetheless, these bellicose young men armed with revolvers and bowie knives and clad in serapes and buckskin represented the only hope that Nancy Darst Crosby and her fellow captives had left. If they were not rescued before reaching the undulating topography of the hill country, they would be taken onto the prairie and very likely never seen again. Neither the captives nor the captors were aware of just how close the Rangers and their cohorts were, though. While the raiding party made its languid march northwestward, the Rangers were making every move within their power to garner additional forces, as well as track the Comanche. The Ranger ranks included men whose names would become legendary in the annals of Texas history: Bigfoot Wallace, Ben and Henry McCulloch, Matthew Old Paint Caldwell, Ed Burleson, John Tumlinson, and Jack Hayes. Several of the Rangers had been tracking the Comanche with the help of their Tonkawa scouts under their chief, Placido. The Tonkawa are a tribe native to central Texas who had been devastated for generations by Comanche raiding and expansion. All too often unheralded in conventional narratives of the West, native scouts were essentially the only trackers skilled enough to actually find villages that forces like the Rangers and the U.S. Army sought to engage. Their willingness to assist in hunting down and often killing their fellow native peoples speaks to just how deep the divisions could run between tribes. At the same time, local militia forces from around the area were being marshaled under the leadership of the relatively inexperienced Felix Huston. They received word that they were to rendezvous with the Rangers at a designated spot on a small tributary of the San Marcos River, about 40 miles north-northeast of San Antonio. Huston and his volunteers arrived at this spot on what is today known as Plum Creek, dismounted, and waited for the Comanche. They had placed themselves directly in line with the Comanche's path, and it would be only a short time until the lumbering Comanche party came into view. But for all their bloodlust and anger, the relative neophytes to combat on the Texas frontier hesitated. The Comanche party, although composed in large part of women, children, and elderly members, was still far larger than the Texans. Though they had the advantage in position and firepower, plus the element of surprise, Huston was unwilling to make an outright attack on the party until the more experienced Rangers arrived. The Rangers, for their part, were all making their way as fast as possible to the scene, but as some were coming from a variety of locations due to having been out on patrol, the arrival of their full force had been momentarily delayed. Huston was, undoubtedly, in a difficult position. Should he make a cavalier charge, one he was ill-equipped to lead, he might lose many of his own men. Thus, Huston and his volunteers took up a defensive position, hunkering down and preparing to receive the Comanche charge that would inevitably come when they were spotted. Huston's men dismounted, a nearly always mortal mistake in warfare against mounted tribes, and began to pepper the large Comanche party with shots, as well as make half-hearted advances, only to be driven back by Comanche attacks. The Comanche warriors, perhaps the world's best horsemen at the time, began to ride back and forth in front of their people, red streamers whipping in the wind and new top hats flying off their heads. They rode suicidally close to the Texan lines, with some indeed losing their lives to Texan bullets. For the Comanche, though, as has been noted by several military tacticians, these were not offensive attacks meant to unseat the Texans from their ground, nor even necessarily kill them all. The Comanche intention, with their great visual display and seemingly complete disregard for their own personal well-being, was to create a distraction that would be so all-encompassing for their enemy that the retreat of their wives and children would go unnoticed. For roughly half an hour, these exchanges continued. As the Rangers began to arrive and assess the situation, though, they became more and more impatient with Huston's refusal to take offensive action. Just then, a Comanche chief with a resplendent white shield and feather headdress led a charge to within yards of the Texas position. But the Texan bullocks managed to cut him down on his retreat back to his line, and at this point, everything changed. The Comanche, who often believed a warrior's medicine or puha would make him invulnerable to bullets, were so shaken by this that an all-out retreat began. And at this point, the Rangers' patience with Huston had been exhausted. Ben McCulloch, a legendary Ranger captain, exhorted the volunteer commander that, "Now's the time, Captain. Charge 'em. They are whipped." Every second they hesitated meant more distance between themselves and the Comanche, and more importantly, the Comanche's captives. The Texans mounted and the Rangers led the way as a running fight would ensue over roughly 15 miles of rolling prairie and cactus-strewn hills. The Comanche continued westward toward the hillier country around the Colorado River west of Austin. For hours arrows flew, screams and gunshots resounded, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the iron-tinged aroma of blood. Bodies of men, women, and children littered the ground. The wounded were shot dead without exception. One Comanche woman's head was stomped into an unrecognizable mass of bone and tissue. Eventually, the volunteers, Rangers, and Tonkawa scouts would regroup to assess their losses and to discuss the next course of action. They had inflicted at least 80 dead upon the Comanche and sent them fleeing for their lives into the hill country. By mathematical standards, the Battle of Plum Creek, as it would come to be known, was a resounding victory for the Texans. However, they had only recovered a fraction of the 3,000 head of horses that had been stolen, as well as a fraction of the goods that had been apprehended. And though they had certainly hastened the retreat of their adversaries, the Texans as a whole had failed in achieving their primary objective, the recapturing of the hostages that had been taken by the Comanche. And when the scouting parties were sent out, they came upon the horrific consequences of their failure. Nancy Crosby was found not long before sundown. She had been tied to a tree, presumably crying out and fighting. As the battle whirled nearby, the gunshots and battle cries likely drowned out her desperate pleas to be spared. But she was not spared. Nancy Crosby was mercilessly drilled with several Comanche arrows through her torso. Her death had likely been quick, but certainly not painless. In the last week of Nancy Crosby's life, she had been kidnapped, assaulted, watched her husband and then her baby killed in front of her, and been subjected to endless torment and torture at the hands of her captors. Her only fleeting hope had seemed all too close, and then her life was ruthlessly snuffed out when her rescue was presumably only minutes away. One could be forgiven for thinking that such horrors were the exception, but Nancy Crosby's story was all too common on the bleeding frontier of Texas. This was not the land of dime novels or tall tales. This was an unforgiving place that was seemingly inextricably ensconced in a cycle of violence, grief, and revenge. But, as S.C. Gwynn points out in Empire of the Summer Moon, the deaths of Nancy Crosby and her fellow captives were not the result of random violence. Their lives were seen as currency, as just retribution for the Minnepaneteca Comanche who had been cut down in the streets and courthouse of San Antonio. Those Comanche were killed in retribution for the treatment of the young Matilda Lockhart. Matilda Lockhart had been kidnapped and treated as a subhuman because she was of a people who were trespassing on, killing, and attempting to end the way of life of the Comanche, just as the Comanche had done to the Apache before them. And so the story of the Old West goes, an endless succession of transgression and retribution. Many of the Rangers there that day would go on to legendary careers and fight in some of the most significant battles in the history of Texas. Huston would be forever hampered in his political ambitions by the prevailing, and not wholly inaccurate, perception that he had cost at least some of the captives their lives due to his unwillingness to pursue more offensive tactics. The Battle of Plum Creek would be only the beginning in the Texas conflict with the Comanche. However, it would mark the last time the Comanche would attempt raiding of such a massive scale and scope. The bloodshed in Texas would not only carry on for decades to come, it would only intensify. The tales of raiding, rescue, and revenge in the Old West are innumerable, and rest assured we here at HOKC will do our best to cover all of them. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times. Northern Texas, September 12, 1874. As a cyclone of more than 100 Kiowa and Comanche warriors encircles them, unleashing a hail of bullets and arrows, a small group of U.S. Army scouts and soldiers are caught in the open prairie, fighting for their lives. All of them have incurred varying degrees of battle wounds thus far, with some in critical condition. They are a 6-man detachment of 4 enlisted men, Sergeant Woodhull and Privates Rath, Harrington, and Smith, as well as 2 Army scouts, Amos Chapman and Billy Dixon. Dixon is already a legend on the frontier, having made a name for himself only months earlier at the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, where his ability to shoot down a Comanche chief from nearly a half a mile away had turned the tide of the battle and likely saved the lives of all of his comrades. Now, it seems that Dixon and his cohorts will find no such luck on this day, as the open prairie offers them nothing in the way of cover or concealment. This detail of men has been dispatched by Colonel Nelson A. Miles to carry dispatches concerning the delay of supplies being brought to his camp by Captain Willis Lyman's supply train. This delay had itself been the result of Kiowa and Comanche warriors stalling its progress with incessant raiding and attacks. Now, a smaller contingent of Kiowa and Comanche have diverted their forces to concentrate on the errant scouting detail. These attacks are not random occurrences. They are part of the ongoing Red River War, which will ultimately be the beginning of the end of the decades-long conflict between the tribes of the Southern Plains and the United States government. The Kiowa and Comanche have long been the dominant tribes here in the north of Texas, and are intent on fighting to the bitter end for their lands. The violence that has unfolded in the preceding decade and a half has been among the worst the already bloody history of Texas has ever seen. Countless innocents on both sides have perished. Countless combatants have lost their lives in brutal, bloody engagements, and untold amounts of lands and goods have been lost. It is well known amongst all soldiers and scouts that being caught in the open by the Kiowa and Comanche would be among the worst of all possible scenarios on the Texas plains. These warriors, though having relatively little in the way of formal hierarchy and militaristic structure, are perhaps the best light cavalry on the planet at this time. They are capable of feats of horsemanship largely only seen in present-day trick-riding exhibitions, all while being able to fire several arrows a minute. Their tactics, well known but incredibly difficult to combat, are to bear down upon their adversaries in whirling cyclonic attacks, before eventually dispersing in scattered groups across the plains at the conclusion of the fight. For a United States Army whose last major conflict was the American Civil War, the difference between the more stratified, organized warfare of that conflict and defending and attacking against these highly mobile groups of guerrilla fighters is a stark, startling contrast. Billy Dixon is one of the most experienced scouts in the Army in this style of warfare, but even to him, this present fight seems to be in sheer futility, as he and his cohorts are easy targets for their adversaries. As soon as the attack commenced, every one of the men had known it would be only a matter of time until one of them was struck down by the Kiowa and Comanche fire. The first unfortunate soldier to fall would be Private George Smith, the man put in charge of holding the horses so as to keep them from stampeding away during the fight. Private Smith is hit only minutes into the fight with a bullet passing through one of his lungs, sending the man crumbling to the ground and setting the horses loose. The horses are still fully loaded with the men's haversacks, coats, blankets, and water canteens. In only a few moments, the soldiers have lost not only one of their own, but their supplies and transportation as well. The only option now would be to fight to the last man. The Kiowa and Comanche, however, seeing their enemies to now be easy targets, are in no rush to risk losing any of their own men with needlessly risky attacks. Therefore, they now engage in intermittent small attacks, with each warrior in these smaller groups seeking to win glory for their deeds of bravery and gallantry, measured by how close they are able to attack and how much damage they are able to inflict. The majority of their ire is directed away from the group of 5 soldiers and concentrated on the seemingly lifeless body of George Smith. The unfortunate Smith had been first assumed to be dead by his comrades, and they made great efforts to stop the attacking warriors from capturing his body. But Smith is, in fact, still alive and in great agony, but unable to do anything to assist himself. As the waves of attack press nearer and nearer to him, he can only lie prostrate and motionless as his friends attempt to defend him. Finally, though, the fight becomes too intense for any of the remaining men to hold their current exposed positions. Dixon spots a small mesquite flat over a quarter-mile away and suggests that the men make a run for its relative cover. But just before they can make their move, Dixon's fellow Army scout, Amos Chapman, is struck by a bullet. He matter-of-factly alerts his comrade, "Billy, I am hit at last." Though Dixon is looking at Chapman when he is shot, he is not able to ascertain the severity of the wound to his comrade while keeping up the fight himself. However, during his next lookout onto the prairie to fire upon the charging warriors, Dixon spots a closer option for cover, a shallow depression in the plains not far from their current position. The depression, known as a buffalo wallow, is the result of the buffalo herds who still frequent the area, pawing and wallowing in the prairie dirt. Though it is not ideal, it would certainly be an improvement from their current circumstances. So, Dixon shouts to his comrades that he will make a break for the buffalo wallow in an attempt to see close up whether or not it will provide a suitable place for them to make a defensive stand. He then makes a mad dash amongst withering Kiowa and Comanche fire to the wallow, which measures roughly 10 feet by 10 feet. Dixon determines that the shallow depression will provide enough cover and yells for the remainder of his able-bodied comrades to follow his lead. This they do, and within minutes the men are busy digging with their hands and bowie knives, piling up the soft sand to the edges of the wallow in between defending against the charges of the native warriors. The Kiowa and Comanche now, for their part, intensify their attacks on the buffalo wallow, seeing a more immediate need to finish off their quarry. As the day drags into the afternoon, the psyches of some of the men caught in this desperate plight in the middle of the buffalo wallow begin to fray. The following is Billy Dixon's first-hand account of one of his comrades reaching their perceived psychological limits during the vicious engagement. Many times that terrible day did I think that my last moment was at hand. Once, when the Indians were crowding us awfully hard, one of the boys raised up and yelled, "No use, boys, no use. We might as well give it up." We answered by shouting him to lie down. At that moment, a bullet struck the soft sand near him and completely filled his mouth with dirt. I was so amused that I laughed, though in a rather sickly way, for none of us felt much like laughing. In a lull in the fighting, one of the men shouts to Amos Chapman, still alive but badly wounded, telling him to make his way over to the buffalo wallow. Chapman shouts back that the bullet that struck him has broken his leg, and he is unable to walk. Dixon decides that he, as the most able-bodied man available, having suffered only a slight wound to his right calf, will make an attempt to save his friend and fellow scout. Returning to Dixon's account, I made several efforts to reach him before I succeeded. Every time the Indians saw me start, they would fire such a volley that I was forced to retreat, until I finally made a run and got to Chapman. I told him to climb on my back, my plan being to carry him as I would a little child. Drawing both his legs in front of me and laying the broken one over the sound one to support it, I carried him to the wallow, though not without difficulty, as he was a larger man than myself, and his body a dead weight. It taxed my strength to carry him. Now, all of the men, in their various states of injury and agony, begin to silently, deliberately, dig and scoop more of the silted earth up into the short wall around the edge of the wallow. Despite their composure, the dire nature of their situation only intensifies, as the attacks increase in frequency and ferocity before one of the chiefs is shot down. Dixon's account continues. When I look back and recall our situation, I always find myself thinking of how my wounded companions never complained or faltered, but fought as bravely as if a bullet had not touched them. Sometimes the Indians would ride towards us at headlong speed with lances lifted and poised, undoubtedly bent on spearing us. Such moments made a man brace himself and grip his gun. Fortunately, we were able to keep our heads and bring down or disable the leader. Such charges proved highly dangerous to the Indians, and gradually grew less frequent. For much of the afternoon, as the hot sun beats down upon them, the men on both sides fight on. The warriors continue their assaults on the buffalo wallow, while the ammunition of the scouts and soldiers begins to dwindle. The thoughts of every man within the buffalo wallow, at some point or another during the long afternoon, drift to the horrifying possibility of the worst possible outcome in this situation, being captured alive. Dixon recalls, "Ours was the courage of despair. We knew what would befall us if we should be captured alive. We had seen too many naked and mangled bodies of white men who had been spread-eagled and tortured with steel and fire to forget what our own fate would be, so we were determined to fight to the end." Then, just when it seems things cannot possibly become more desperate, the North Texas weather undertakes one of its notorious sudden changes, as storm clouds seem to fill the sky out of nowhere. At around 3 o'clock, a torrential downpour manages not only to soak the exposed men and their equipment, but to fill the bottom of the buffalo wallow with roughly 2 inches of muddy brown water, which mixes with the blood and gore of the wounded men, creating a nightmarish miasma. But the storm also serves to forestall the attacks of the Kiowa and Comanche. They now sit stoically upon their horses, wrapped snugly in blankets, just out of rifle range, waiting for the storm to pass. Meanwhile, the men in the buffalo wallow have only their thin linen shirts and military boots and pants to ward off the sudden cold. Any of the supplies they may have had are now gone with their horses, along with Dixon's coat, which contains his one and only picture of his mother, given to him by his dying father. But despite the lull in attacks, and in spite of the relentless cold and wet of the storm, the solemn business of surviving the fight at hand still has to be dealt with. With ammunition running low, the men suggest that one of them retrieve the weapon and cartridge belt of the fallen Private George Smith. Private Peter Rath volunteers to undertake this dangerous endeavor. Rath dashes to Private Smith's location, only to discover, to his horror, that Smith is in fact alive and has been left prostrate, bleeding, and suffering for the entirety of the battle. Rath runs back to the buffalo wallow and informs Dixon and the others that Smith is still alive, but too injured to move. Dixon and Rath then make their way back to Smith, where upon further examination, Dixon finds the wound to be all but certainly fatal. Still, they manage to get Smith up and back to the buffalo wallow. Here, as the sky blackens and night falls, the Kiowa and Comanche disappear over the rolling hills of the plains. Smith suffers his final hours in great agony, often begging his comrades to end his suffering. At roughly 11 p.m., his body is found to have gone cold in death. Now, the men are left with the fatal proposition of either going to find help or staying to meet the native warriors the next day. First, Private Rath again volunteers to go out into the night, in search of the trail that will lead them to the nearby Camp Supply. 2 hours later, he returns, disappointedly reporting that he has failed to find the trail. Now, it will be up to Dixon to wait until the first signs of daylight and venture out to find their lifeline to safety. His account of the events continues. Like everything else, the long night finally came to an end, and the sun rose clear and warm the next morning. By this time, all of the men were willing that I should go for help, and I at once started. Daylight exposed me to many dangers from which the night shielded me. By moving cautiously at night, it was possible to avoid the enemy, but if surprised, to stand a good chance of escape. In the daytime, however, the enemy could lie in hiding and scan the country in every direction. On the plains, especially in the fall when the grass is brown, the smallest moving object may be perceived by the trained eye at an astonishingly long distance. I knew that I must proceed with utmost caution, lest I fall into an ambush or be attacked in the open by superior numbers. I had traveled scarcely more than half a mile when I struck the plain trail leading to Camp Supply. Hurrying along as rapidly as possible and keeping a constant lookout for Indians, I checked myself into the sudden sight of an outfit that seemed to cover about an acre of ground 2 miles or so to the northwest. The outfit at first did not appear to be moving, and I could not tell whether it was made up of white men or natives. I skulked to a growth of tall grass and hid for a while. My nerves were too keen to endure hiding and waiting, so I stole back and took another look. The outfit was moving towards me. Shortly, I was able to see that they were troops. I have never felt happier in my life. I wanged loose with my old .50 to attract the attention of the soldiers and saw the whole command come to a halt. I fired my gun a second time, which brought 2 soldiers to me. I told them of our condition, and they rode rapidly back to their command and reported. Dixon now accompanies the soldiers back to the buffalo wallow, but the passing troops offer only some hardtack and water to the injured men, as their surgeons perform only cursory examinations of their wounds before the troop moves on, promising reinforcements will soon come. Meanwhile, the survivors of what history will come to know as the Buffalo Wallow fight bury the body of Private George Smith at the bottom of the wallow they had fought for their lives from. It will be 2 more days of waiting next to a nearby creek before the men would hear the welcome sound of the cavalry coming their way. They will go on to be taken back to Camp Supply and cared for. Amos Chapman's leg will be amputated above the knee, but, in Dixon's recollection, Amos was as tough as second-growth hickory, and was soon out of the hospital and in the saddle. All of the survivors would go on to continue their careers with the Army, as well as stay in touch via letters sent amongst each other for years to come. With a pang of notable regret, Dixon recounts in the last line of the chapter in his memoir concerning the events, "It was always my intention to go back and mark the spot where the Buffalo Wallow fight took place, and where George Smith still lies buried. Procrastination and the remoteness of the spot have prevented my going." Still, all of the survivors of the Buffalo Wallow fight, Sergeant Woodhull and Privates Rath and Harrington, as well as the scouts Amos Chapman and Billy Dixon, were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Private George Smith, who had perished in the midst of the battle, was as well posthumously awarded the medal, the nation's highest honor for military valor in combat. The medals were presented by Colonel Nelson A. Miles, himself a recipient of the award. For their part, the Kiowa and Comanche, as well as their counterparts in the Cheyenne and Southern Arapaho, will continue to combat the United States government in a desperate bid to maintain their homelands and way of life. Their conflict will carry on for another 9 months, finally ending in June of 1875, when Quanah Parker and his band of Quahati Comanche reported to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. The Red River War will go down in the annals of Old West history as one of the most consequential conflicts ever waged on the North American continent. But the many tales of the dangerous, bloody exploits of Billy Dixon and the Army Scouts, as well as the bravery and ruthlessness of the tribes of the Southern Plains during the Red River War, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. West Texas, November 1855. As the cool autumn wind whips around them, a large party of Comanche men, women, and children make their way northeast through the barren country, on their way to the seasonal roaming territory of their most important source of sustenance, the huge herds of American bison, or buffalo, that roam the Great Plains. Though their austere surroundings would be enough to drive almost any mortal being to the brink of endurance, the Comanche seem wholly unbothered as they plod their way across the open prairie. One among their party, however, is visibly bedraggled by the incessant pace, an omnipresent cloud of dust stirred up by the Comanche horses and mules. He is a captive of the Comanche, taken as a human spoil of war in their ongoing conflict with the Texas Rangers and cattle ranchers who ventured out further onto the frontier with every passing year. His name is Nelson Lee. Only months prior, he had been a member of a group of enterprising horse traders who had been making the treacherous journey to Southern California to sell their vast herd of valuable horses and mules at a markedly higher price than they might garner in Texas, Louisiana, or east of the Mississippi. The party of 27 men had been set upon by the Comanche, and only Nelson Lee, William Akins, Thomas Martin, and Jonathan Stewart had managed to survive. Akins and Lee had been forced to watch as Martin and Stewart were subjected to vicious, hours-long torture killings at the hands of the Comanche. They had then been divided up amongst the war chiefs, and Lee had been designated as a slave to the renowned warrior Spotted Leopard. Lee will be relegated to the menial tasks of completing chores in camp, as well as the gory, stinking work of skinning and gutting the hulking buffalo that are harvested. His only hopes for survival are to comply with his captors in the Comanche. Though the nearly unbearable pangs of loneliness and isolation incessantly tear at his psyche, Lee's experience is not entirely unique on the Texas frontier. For decades now, across the whole of central Texas, entire families have been killed or carried off, and entire farmsteads laid waste to by Comanche raiders intent on driving out any and all intruders from their hard-won lands. This policy is not necessarily driven as much by racial motives as it is by cultural ones, as the Comanche reserve the same treatment for any and all of their enemies, be they Anglo-Texans, Tejanos, Mexicans, Americans, Spanish, or members of rival tribes like the Tonkawa, Caddo, and Cheyenne. The Comanche have risen to prominence in this harsh land after migrating southward from the northern ranges of the Rocky Mountains after acquiring the horse in the 17th century. In the ensuing time period, they had swept through the southern plains and wrested virtually the whole of Texas from the control of perhaps their most hated enemy, the Apache. Though the vast majority of their encounters on the open expanses of the frontier have gone unrecorded in the annals of Western posterity, the results of the sheer brutality of this conflict were on clear display to the Spanish friars who inhabited the Catholic mission of San Saba, near today's town of the same name. Here, the resident priests saw what amounted to veritable hordes of Apache fleeing into the confines and comparative safety of the mission walls, in search of salvation from the incessant attacks of the Comanche. The Apache, too, have unleashed countless attacks on Comanche villages, killing men, women, and children, and taking any spoils and captives that they could. This cycle of violence is also not at all unique to the southern plains, but what is about to take place will be one of the few glimpses garnered by captive sources of the brutal realities of intertribal warfare. Unbeknownst to this Comanche band now traveling through these vast expanses, a group of Apache, also out on a hunting trip in hopes of fortifying their stock of meat for the winter ahead, is in the immediate vicinity. As the Comanche band, traveling in a group spread out over roughly a quarter of a mile, makes their way through a short expanse of hills and streams that dots the otherwise flat country, both parties are woefully unaware of the other's presence. The Comanche's extended traveling line is bookended by their group of pack mules in the back and a younger group of warriors to the front who dash back and forth playfully as the rest of the party plods away. Lee and Spotted Leopard ride near the rear, near the mules. Though he is still figuratively bound in the role of a captive slave, for the first time in many weeks, Lee is able to enjoy relatively unfettered movement as his limbs are left untied in order to enable him to work. He even has some measure of assurance that, as the Comanches have not yet killed him as they had his companions, he might even be able to someday become an adopted member of the tribe, an incredibly rare circumstance for any fighting-age male prisoner. For a brief moment, Lee is able to afford himself a psychological reprieve from his current plight. Then, suddenly, the warriors near the front of the procession become visibly animated, some of them dashing back towards Spotted Leopard, and some making their way to the crest of a hill to their immediate left. The cry goes up from the young warriors at the front of the line. The Apache have been spotted, and an attack is underway. Now, there is no time to waste. The lives of every single member of this party of Comanche, including not only their prisoners, but their women and children, are now in immediate danger. The word travels to every warrior that the Apache are approaching from the opposite side of the hill to their left, and the men all now scramble to form a battle line atop the hill in order to receive the oncoming Apache charge. In his autobiography entitled 3 Years Among the Comanche, a narrative of a Texas Ranger, Nelson Lee gives his first-hand account of the beginning of the battle. The whole band dashed upon the hill, except for Spotted Leopard and myself, who remained with the mules in the rear, and on reaching the summit, deployed into the line. By this time, I heard the cry of, "The Apaches! The Apaches!" and knew at once there was hot work at hand. As yet, however, I had seen nothing of an enemy. and only drew the inference that there was one present from the cries that I had heard, and the general commotion that prevailed. In the course of 2 or 3 minutes after our line was formed on the ridge, the air was rent with the noise of the war whoop, and up the opposite ascent, at full speed, came the Apaches in a solid body like a black cloud. As they approached, a shower of arrows were discharged from both lines. Then they rushed upon each other in a hand-to-hand encounter. A vicious fight now unfolds, as the Comanche warriors know that they are the only line of defense between the attacking Apache and their own women and children. Though firearms are certainly not uncommon amongst native frontier tribes by this time in the 1850s, they are not possessed by a great many warriors on either side in this case. Thus, the combat at hand entails up-close and personal encounters fought with spears, clubs, shields, hatchets, and knives. The bloody, violent conflict unfolds with shocking speed and intensity, with the only rules of engagement being victory by any means necessary. The cries of the vanquished and the exhortations of the victors resound about the battlefield, seeming to drown out any and all other sounds in the vicinity. Lee's personal account of the battle continues. From the position I occupied, I had a fair unobstructed view of the battle. It was fierce and terrible. The horses reared and plunged and fell upon each other, their riders dealing blow for blow, and thrust for thrust, some falling from their saddles to the ground, and others trampling madly over them. The Comanches outnumbered the enemy. Nevertheless, they were forced to retreat, falling back down the hill almost to my position. But still, they were not pursued, the Apaches appearing to be content to hold possession of the ground. Soon, the tribe of Spotted Leopard again rallied and dashed once more back into the attack. If possible, this contest was severer, as it was longer than the first. Again, the first blow was given and returned. Again, horses and men intermingled in melee, stumbled, fell, rolled upon the ground, while the wide heavens resounded with their hideous shrieks and cries. My blood thrilled through my veins as I looked upon the scene. I had mingled in encounters fierce even as that, but never before in the midst of the hottest fight was I overcome with such a sense of terror. To be an inactive spectator of a battle is far more painful than to be a participator in it. As the Apache warriors continue their onslaught, and the Comanche fight to defend their families, Lee struggles with the odd dichotomy of his situation as the lone captive observer. His account continues. I hoped devoutly during the engagement that the Comanches would be beaten, being impressed with the belief that if I should fall into the enemy's hands, my chances of escape would be increased, for I had often heard that the Apaches, though a most warlike nation, were more merciful to their prisoners than others of their race. But in this, I was disappointed. The Apaches at length gave way, disappearing beyond the ridge. Instead of pursuing their advantage, however, the Comanches hastily gathered up their dead and retreated towards the mountains we had crossed. As soon as they had left the ground, the Apaches again appeared upon the height and bore away their dead. It was a drawn battle. The Comanche have lost 17 of their own warriors in the fight, with Lee's account estimating that the Apache have likely lost approximately twice that number. The Comanche now commence with the unenviable task of burying their dead, as well as tending to their wounded. Amidst the carnage and sorrow, Lee recounts the Comanche approach to this grisly endeavor. The close of this eventful day was occupied in burying the slain, which ceremony was performed in their customary manner, except they seemed to chant the death song with more energy and feeling than on ordinary occasions. With them, death, at any time, even of the nearest and dearest of their kindred, is not regarded as an event to be deplored, but on the contrary, to be welcomed with rejoicing. But when a warrior dies on the field of battle, their joy and exultation knows no bounds, for their crude theology assures them that his departed spirit is, at once, caught up by the Great Spirit and borne to the region of everlasting and supreme felicity. After the dead are buried, the Comanches' lives, and their hunt for food, must continue. The band makes their way to their seasonal hunting grounds, seeing no more of the Apache along the way. Here, they will remain for 2 months, harvesting buffalo and camping on the open plains. By the next spring, a peace with the Apache will be struck. With the ever-increasing encroachment of American and Mexican settlers into their territories, the two tribes come to view a partnership affording each some form of mutual protection as a far better option to the continued intertribal slaughter. For his part, Lee will eventually escape and go on to continue his adventurous life on the Texas frontier for years to come, ultimately succumbing to an undisclosed illness in New York City on December 21, 1871. But the many tales of brutal intertribal warfare and unyielding violence between settlers and the native tribes of the American frontier, as well as the countless tales of conflict and combat from Nelson Lee's personal account of his life and times in Texas are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Lincoln County, New Mexico, March 9, 1878. Dick Brewer's pale face displays a look of horrified shock as his horse nears the three fallen bodies of his prisoners. Motionless upon the earth in Blackwater Canyon lie Buck Morton, Frank Baker, and William McCloskey. Morton and Baker had been arrested by Brewer's posse just 3 days prior after a miles-long horse chase. They were issued a warrant by the Justice of the Peace on account of their involvement in the murder of John Tunstall. Tunstall was a friend and employer to many of the men in Brewer's party, having worked for the young Englishman at his cattle ranch. The cold-blooded execution of Tunstall was committed after the Lincoln County Sheriff William Brady sent a detachment of men to wrangle cattle from the Tunstall ranch on behalf of a debt owed by Brady's competitor and the business partner of John Tunstall, one Alexander McSween. McSween, a lawyer from St. Louis, had recently settled in Lincoln County with high ambitions. He endeavored to make a fortune for himself in the cattle and dry goods business in the profitable southern New Mexican mountains. The only issue with his lofty aspirations was the near monopoly on these interests held by Sheriff Brady and his partner, James Dolan. Tensions were present from the arrival of McSween and his British business partner, John Tunstall. Brady and Dolan, as well as the numerous men who were allied with them, profited from their cattle trade and their store, known simply as the House, and they were immediately leery about the bright-eyed newcomers attempting to carve out a piece of their pie. McSween would cross a red line that had set off a chain of hostile events sparking the Lincoln County War. A local resident hired McSween to represent them in the service of procuring a life insurance payout for a recently deceased family member. McSween would travel back east and spend several months' effort in securing the sizable payout of the insurance claim. However, the would-be recipient of the claim had also inherited a large debt to the house from the policyholder. If McSween were to deliver the payout to them, the money would almost entirely be going to help his competition. McSween, acting on business instincts instead of morals, withheld the payment to inflict damage upon Brady and Dolan as their legal efforts to come into possession of the funds played out. Sheriff Brady, a lawman with Irish roots and a temper as fierce as the Emerald Isle is green, gained a judgment from the court to attach McSween's property in service of the debt. And attach property he did, storming into McSween's office and selecting far more property than necessary to satisfy the debt. But the sheriff did not stop there. He sent a determined posse of his men to Tunstall's ranch to attach his cattle to the debt of McSween. Tunstall was not implicated in the ruling against McSween, but the sheriff sought to use this opportunity to make a clear statement to his advisers and inflict maximum damage upon them. John Tunstall approached the sheriff's posse alone as they descended upon his ranch, and was shot down with bitter indifference by Brady's men. Tunstall's men had been herding cattle and were attempting to catch up to Tunstall as he made his solo approach, but were only in time to see his still warm body lifeless upon the ground as the sun began to sink behind the mountains. The group of men would label themselves the Regulators, and they set out for vengeance on behalf of John Tunstall. They would even be deputized by the Justice of the Peace and capture Morton and Baker in early March. Dick Brewer had been the de facto leader of the party, but had faced a veritable mutiny as his men went against his wishes and executed Morton, Baker, and McCloskey as Brewer was attempting to return the men to Lincoln to stand trial for the crime against Tunstall. The Lincoln County War, still stands as a timeless narrative that echoes forth from the ages of the Old West. It embodies within it many parables and much hard-learned wisdom, and as the escalations continued to mount, the truism that two wrongs don't make a right, and an eye for an eye would make the whole world blind, stand atop that list. The two deadly exchanges between bitter enemies of the war would not be where the hostilities ceased. The bodies of Baker, Morden, and McCloskey lay in what has come to be known as Dead Man's Draw. Brewer would enlist the help of New Mexican natives to bury them. The rest of the posse did not continue on to Lincoln with Brewer as he grimly rode into town to deliver the news and surrender himself. Brewer arrived in town on the 10th, just a day after McSween had returned himself. After seeking the counsel of his attorney companion, Brewer decided to face whatever legal ramifications were coming his way for his role in the Blackwater disaster, even if it meant his own death. The violence in the southern reaches of the territory had summoned the governor of New Mexico to travel to Lincoln and intercede, but the townspeople hoping for an impartial authority to set their troubles at ease would be further disappointed. Governor Axtell arrived in Lincoln on the morning of March 9th, and he spent just 3 hours investigating the matter that had gripped his southern territory, doing so while in the ever-present company of James Dolan. The governor deferred the opportunity to interview any neutral parties in the region, nor did he request a meeting with McSween to diplomatically attempt to find a resolution and bring about peace. As a citizen attempted to inform Axtell on the confluence of events that had led them to this precipitous situation, he simply demurred, "I know all about the matter and its cause, and I have already taken such action as I deem necessary." The governor's vague response to the citizen may be cleared up with his official decree. The primary action that would be taken by the governor on account of his trip to Lincoln, which would appear in the Cimarron News and Press on March 21, 1878, and contain, in part, the following. To the citizens of Lincoln County, the disturbed condition of affairs at the county seat brings me to Lincoln County at this time. My only object is to assist the good citizens to uphold the laws and keep the peace. First, John B. Wilson's appointment by the county commissioners as Justice of the Peace was illegal and void. Second, the appointment of Robert Weidman as U.S. Marshal has been revoked. Third, the President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, upon an application made by me as Governor of New Mexico, has directed the post commander, Colonel Purington, to assist territorial civil officers in maintaining order and enforcing legal process. The governor's decree had retroactively undermined the efforts of the regulators to bring Tunstall's assailants to justice. By voiding John B. Wilson's appointments as Justice of the Peace, the warrants he issued for Morton and Baker were also vitiated, as well as his deputizing of the regulators. Now, the only officers of the court were Brady and his deputies, which included the remaining men who had carried out Tunstall's execution. The governor then went so far as to invoke the President of the United States to send a military intervention to the county to carry out the suppression efforts on behalf of Sheriff Brady. If Governor Axtell had intended to deliver a crushing blow to the citizens who were already working themselves into a rebellious fervor towards the county authorities, his effect had done just the opposite. After the one-sided proclamation and the disregard for the cold-blooded slaying of Tunstall, the time for relying upon the system to bring about justice was long over. Dick Brewer had learned of the governor's action from McSween upon his return, and his resolution to face the legal ramifications for what had occurred in Blackwater would be drastically altered. McSween instead instructed Brewer to give Lincoln County a, quote, wide berth until court was convened and there may be clarity brought to the issues plaguing the county. Brewer would leave during the night to his farm in Ruidoso. He would also deliver the message to all those who had been deputized that they were now essentially outlaws, stripped of all law enforcement abilities. On Monday the 11th, Alexander McSween fled Lincoln as well. He would take refuge in the town of Pecos, within John Chisholm's ranch. It was his plan to stay thereabouts until court had convened, then stand trial on embezzlement charges for his role in withholding the life insurance funds from his client. On the 13th, just 2 days after McSween's exit from Lincoln, the Jesse Evans gang would appear on the scene once more. The gang, now without members Baker and Morton, still boasted its namesake Jesse Evans, as well as his favored accomplice, Tom Hill. The outlaw gang had acted as mercenaries on behalf of Sheriff Brady in the death of John Tunstall, and had been hiding out in the Sacramento mountains. They moved down from their hideout towards Tularosa, and would come upon the camp of German sheepherder John Wagner. Jesse Evans and Tom Hill were at this point desperate for supplies and provisions. Wagner had been herding a flock of nearly 4,000 sheep from California en route to Concho County in Texas. He had made camp near Tularosa and was out with his flock when Evans and Hill descended into his camp. Only the driver of the wagon was present in the camp when the gang members began looting, and they were so focused on their objective that they failed to see Wagner approaching them alone as he returned to the camp. The elder herdsman grabbed a hold of a rifle belonging to Hill, which the intruder had left leaning upon a tree, and began firing with lethal intention upon the men. Tom Hill was immediately killed, and Jesse Evans was seriously wounded, having been shot twice, with one shot hitting him in the wrist and another penetrating his lungs. Improbable as it was, Evans managed to make an escape on horseback, riding into the night into the Oregon mountains, where he would reach Shedd's ranch and be given a welcome reception. Evans would hole up there for a few days, but his grave condition prompted him into turning himself into Fort Stanton, so he could be given care for his wounds, which he feared would soon become mortal. With Tom Hill, Baker, and Morton now dead, Jesse Evans would now have a story about the killing of Tunstall that would provide plenty of opportunities to scapegoat his expired companions. The recently removed U.S. Marshal Weidenman and Governor Axtell would publish contradictory letters in the New Mexican, a journal publication out of Santa Fe that took to attacking Weidenman on the governor's behalf. Their contention hinging on the fact that Weidenman had written a letter describing the events of Tunstall's slaying to an attorney friend in San Francisco, and that the contents held within the letter and its date showed that Weidenman had taken action he could not have been authorized to take, on account of the fact that the district court had not yet convened at that point to issue the warrants, and therefore the arrest could not have been carried out under the letter of the law at the time they were issued by Weidenman. The article delivered a rhetorical assault upon Weidenman and the regulators in an attempt to shift public opinion behind the governor and his course of action. It also painted a picture of the territory that was now under dispute, much of which stands true to this day. Quote, Lincoln is the southeast corner county of New Mexico. It is partly inhabited by Indians, the Mescalero Apache, who blows where he listeth, by Texas cattlemen, a few traders and businessmen, and a few skeleton companies of the United States troops. The letter provoked Weidenman to offer a rebuttal. Quote, The comments, like all others made by the gentlemanly editors, are full of Billingsgate and blatherskite. Mud and dirt are, as usual, freely thrown, and I with others am of the opinion that the editors unfortunately mistake their calling. Weidenman, clearly on the attack, proceeded to call into question not only the publication, but the actions of the lawmen of Lincoln County and the governor for their biased and myopic view of the violent late winter's war. A session of court had been announced for April 1st, though it was supposed to be scheduled for the 8th. Members of the regulators, acting independently of McSween as well as their recognized leader Dick Brewer, gathered near the court on the evening of March 31st in anticipation of the announced court session the following morning. Amongst them were Billy the Kid, Frank McNab, Jim French, Fred Waite, Henry Middleton, and Henry Brown. They spent the evening at the Tunstall store, stoking one another's tempers and recollections of the recent injustices. Around 9 o'clock on the morning of the 1st, Sheriff Brady, along with several deputies and allies, walked from the Dolan store at the west end of town toward the courthouse. They informed prospective jurors that the court date had been announced in error and they would be convening the following Monday instead. As they walked through the town on their way to the court, they passed directly by Tunstall's store, doing so without incident. They then started to make their way back towards Dolan's headquarters. The corral at the rear of Tunstall's store was surrounded with high adobe walls with a narrow driveway on the east side of the building. The driveway had a wooden gate from which anyone approaching from the east could clearly be seen, but those approaching from the west could not be seen until they were right upon the gate as the vantage point was blocked by the building that housed the Tunstall store. The regulators watched through this gate as Brady and his men walked back towards Dolan's store from the courthouse. Their group was scattered about, not walking in unison, when suddenly a series of rifle shots cut through the morning air. Brady fell at once, stopped dead in his tracks. Later, his recovered body would display at least a dozen bullet wounds. His deputy, George Heineman, was pierced by a single bullet, but after managing to stagger back a few steps in the direction of the courthouse, he fell dead as well, his last words a frightened plea for water. A bystander was shot just below the hip while hoeing an onion patch, but it was only a flesh wound. As Billy the Kid and French raced over to Brady's body, accounts vary as to their motives. Some assert that it was to recover the kid's previously seized pistol, while others say that it was to take the arrest warrant Brady held for McSween. Nevertheless, Billy the Kid was then shot on the inside of his left thigh. The bullet that struck the kid and also wounded French was fired by one Deputy Matthews, who had successfully taken cover amidst the fray of gunfire. The wound French received required him to briefly take refuge in the crawl space of a local citizen's home. Weidenman was in the corral where the gunfire emanated from, but claimed he was only there to feed Tunstall's dog. While perhaps true, it became a much derided alibi. Once the gunfire had ceased and the town had quieted, the regulators, aside from Billy the Kid, rode out of town. As they passed the outskirts of town, John Long fired 4 shots upon them from his rifle, one seriously wounding French. The regulators returned fire and made their escape. Billy the Kid's wound, while not serious, made horseback riding highly difficult, and he would make his own exit from town a couple of days later. The latest and most daring act of violence that had yet occurred in the Lincoln County War would bring to town Captain G.A. Purington and 25 soldiers from Fort Stanton. A town-wide search, door to door, was conducted for any remaining belligerents from the attacking party. Sheriff Brady was now dead. The governor's attempts to quell the mutinous fervor amongst the regulators had failed, and now even the military had been called in. 3 days after the attack on Brady and his men, the regulators headed southwest out of Lincoln. Brady's deputies and Captain Purington made a round of arrests. Unable to capture any of the 6 men who participated in the shooting, they went after Robert Weidenman, who admitted to being in the corral but not to being a party to the massacre. They also took McSween's brother-in-law, a man by the last name of Shield, into custody. McSween was arrested as soon as he arrived back in town, but McSween had brought to town with him an ally from Colorado, Dr. Montague R. Leverson, who had been staying at John Chisholm's ranch. Through his connections in the Hayes administration, he was able to put pressure upon prominent New York politicians regarding their dealings with McSween. McSween, Weidenman, and Shield were all taken to Fort Stanton. McSween's wife and allies stayed at the nearby trader's post to be available to lend their support. On April 4th, just 3 days after the death of Sheriff Brady, one of the most infamous gun battles of the Old West would occur at Blazer's Mill, a sawmill and trading post that supplied beef to the Mescalero Apache. It belonged to Dr. Joseph Hoy Blazer, an Indian affairs agent, and Blazer's wife ran a diner of sorts for travelers passing through. Dick Brewer and his men had stopped in at around 11 a.m. on that unseasonably warm spring day for lunch. As the regulators had passed through Ruidoso Valley, they had welcomed the addition of 5 new recruits, including Frank Coe and his cousin, George Coe. They piled into the Blazers' dining room, stacking their rifles against the wall, then gathered around a table awaiting their meal. Andrew Buckshot Roberts then rode up on his mule, leaving his pistol and cartridge belt as he made his way into the diner. But as he approached the front door, he caught a glimpse of several rifles stacked against the wall. He then retreated back to grab his own weapon. Roberts headed across the road to an office for the sawmill operated by Dr. Blazer. Roberts had been preparing to leave the country, but was waiting on some necessary letters to arrive there first. Buckshot Roberts was on the run because he had been a member of the posse that had shot down John Tunstall. As he made his way across the road, one of the regulators recognized him and cried out, "Here's Buck Roberts!" Brewer was still in possession of a warrant for his arrest. Before the men had a chance to take an easy shot at Roberts, Brewer called them to restrain themselves. Then, just as he had done with Morton and Baker, Brewer attempted to bring Buckshot Roberts in peacefully. Brewer would regret his decision. Brewer sent Frank Coe, who was well acquainted with Roberts, to persuade him to surrender peacefully. Roberts asked Coe to join him in Dr. Blazer's office to discuss the situation, but Coe declined, fearing he could be taken hostage. They instead sat on the doorstep of a wide room inside the Adobe structure. Coe informed Roberts of the warrant they held, and that Brewer was guaranteeing his safety, and they only wanted to deliver him to the proper authorities. Naturally, Buckshot scoffed at this. "Surrender? Never. Never while I'm alive. Kid Antrim is with you and he would kill me on sight. Don't I know what happened to Morton and Baker?" The revenge killing of Morton and Baker in Blackwater County after their arrest by the regulators would make it nearly impossible for anyone to acquiesce to them peacefully. Add to that the assassination of Sheriff Brady, and the problem was even further compounded. Nevertheless, Coe continued to plead his case. Buckshot had earned his nickname because of his many hard battles with the natives, the Texas Rangers, and other wranglers and cowboys. He was not a large man by any measure, but he endured, in spite of having one arm crippled to the point he could not raise his rifle up to his shoulder. His body bore the scars of a hardscrabble life on the frontier, and the prospect of squaring off in a shootout with 15-1 odds did not cause him to flinch. The regulators that were awaiting Robert's surrender grew restless, and after some time, Brewer sent George Coe, Henry Middleton, and Charles Beaudry over to attempt to arrest Roberts without incident. As Beaudry came upon the two men, he called out, "Roberts, throw up your hands!" Buckshot Roberts snarled back a defiant, "No!" and sprang up to his feet, but before he could fire off a round, Beaudry inflicted a gruesome gut shot to the wanted man. As the abdomen of Roberts flailed with agonizing intensity, he pushed through the door of the office, then threw a mattress over the doorway to barricade himself within. Through his covered position, he began to send out returning fire. His first shot cut the belt directly off the waist of Charles Beaudry. The next struck George Coe directly in his trigger finger as he went to fire his gun, severing the digit just above the knuckle, a 1 in a million shot delivered with cinematic perfection. The third shot pierced the chest of Henry Middleton, inflicting a serious wound to his lungs. And, as if he were a magnet for non-lethal gunshot injuries, another round grazed the arm of Billy the Kid. If they had any designs on waiting out Roberts to expend his ammunition, they would be disappointed. It was revealed to them that the office he had taken refuge in also housed Dr. Blazer's Springfield rifle and over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Dick Brewer then managed to regain order of his men. He instructed them to stay out of the line of fire, and that he would take up a position to see into the doorway where Roberts was holed up within. He crossed the road and took cover behind the protection of some sizable logs lying upon the ground near the sawmill. As Brewer slowly rose his head above the lumber, Roberts saw the hat rising over the top of the logs. Roberts took aim just below the brim of the hat and fired. Brewer was struck by a bullet square between the eyes and fell dead at once. The regulators could do nothing but watch in stunned horror from their position. Brewer had been their leader through good times and bad, and with varying degrees of efficacy, but his abrupt loss had thrown the party into total disarray. The men deserted the area without even attempting to recover the body of their fallen leader. They retreated to George Coe's residence on the Ruidoso River. Back at Blazer's mill, Buckshot Roberts was so gravely wounded through the stomach that Dr. Blazer had sent for the surgeon at Fort Stanton. But Roberts could not be saved. He passed the following day, and was buried in a grave directly adjacent to the one that had been freshly dug for Dick Brewer. Alexander McSween would soon learn of the events at Blazer's mill, and send an account of the events to the Cimarron News and Press, published on April 18th. McSween relayed the events of the 2 shooting incidents, the wounds to Buckshot Roberts as well as to his allied men, and the death of their leader. He would eulogize Brewer in the statement, quote, "Richard M. Brewer was one of nature's noble men, physically faultless, generous to a fault, a giant in friendship, possessing an irreproachable character and unsullied honor. Kind, amiable, and gentle in disposition, he has fallen early into the 3x6 promised him 18 months ago. Murderers and horse thieves hated him. Their friends hated him. But the people, Mexican and American, held him in the highest possible esteem." The loss of Brewer was not just the death of an honorable man in an increasingly violent and unnecessary conflict. It represented the loss of order within the roughshod rank and file of the Regulators. Brewer presented an outwardly civil and organized face to the public in regards to the group. The remaining members could be considered to be varying degrees of law-abiding, with some being downright despised. The vacant sheriff position would be filled by John Copeland, who was appointed as Sheriff Brady's successor, but after a short time it was ascertained that he would not be wholly favorable towards Murphy and Dolan's interests, opting instead for a neutral position in an effort to restore peace to Lincoln. Copeland would eventually be relieved of his command and replaced by George Pepin. George Pepin was one of Brady and Dolan's oldest allies in the territory. Pepin was easily swayed. He exhibited a relatively weak demeanor, certainly in comparison to Brady, and could be instructed to do the bidding of the House complicitly. Sheriff Pepin would continue the use of deputized members of the Murphy-Dolan faction, including Jesse Evans, who was also a suspect in the death of John Tunstall. Along with the Jesse Evans gang already aggressive involvement, the Seven Rivers Warriors began posturing to make a move in the ongoing Lincoln County conflict. News came out of Roswell, at the time just a small 2 or 3 house settlement 60 miles east of Lincoln. The crux of the matter was the favorable court ruling McSween had won the month prior. A letter was published in the Las Vegas Gazette on April 28th, written by one Marion Turner. Quote, "As far as legal proceedings are concerned, the difficulties in Lincoln County were settled on the 15th of this month. The change to the grand jury by Judge Bristol was denunciatory in the action of McSween and laudatory to the opposite party, the head of which is supposed to be Major Murphy and the firm of J.J. Dolan and Company. My firm belief is that although the adherents of these parties have been guilty in, quote, killing their enemies, there was no murder in the matter, but a contest for, quote, the best of the fight." Turner was clearly unhappy with the result that favored McSween, but even beyond that, he attempted to reframe Lincoln County violence as being a byproduct of war and not actions that were subjectable to laws of homicide and mayhem. The, quote, Pecos men, the Seven Rivers Warriors, also took umbrage with a statement by Dick Brewer's successor as leader of the Regulators, Frank McNab. McNab had made a statement after the favorable McSween ruling that the Regulators intended to, quote, close out all who had been involved with cattle wrangling in Lincoln County. The Seven Rivers people were notorious for their cattle thievery. McNab said that they would soon come down to, quote, clean them up. One of the Seven Rivers Warriors' loudest voices rebuked this, stating, "What do they think we are, a pack of mice?" On the 29th, the Seven Rivers Warriors had reached the location of the Fritz Ranch, roughly 8 miles south of Lincoln. There were 35 men in total. With them was George Pepin and several other Murphy-Dolan loyalists. Frank McNab, Frank Coe, and Ab Sanders were traveling after dinner in Lincoln towards their farm in Hondo. As they rounded a bend, they were spotted by a detachment of the Seven Rivers Warriors men, who had recognized the Regulators at once, as McNab had stood out to them. In unison, McNab, Coe, and Sanders were fired upon. McNab was mortally wounded. His recovered body would exhibit numerous bullet holes. Sanders fell from his steed. He had survived, but was terribly wounded himself. Coe had jumped from his horse and managed to come away unscathed. He would scurry into a recess in the hillside and keep up a continuous fire until running out of munitions. Coe then surrendered under the assurance that his life would be spared and, as he was not the primary target, which Frank McNab had been, he acquiesced. Coe was taken to Fort Stanton to be treated for his wounds. The Seven Rivers Warriors men then descended upon Lincoln under the cover of night, stationing themselves within the Dolan store. They stated that they wanted to be granted permission to deliver the same frontier justice to Alexander McSween and his adherents that they had wrought upon Sheriff Brady. One Captain Saturnino Baca refused to be party to this murderous scheme. The Seven Rivers men spent the night in town and conspired to make an attack, but when dawn arrived and illuminated the town of Lincoln, they saw Ellis's place, tightly shut and guarded. Within were several McSween allies, armed and ready for battle. The Seven Rivers men instead opted to offer their help to Sheriff Copeland to make arrests for those involved in the death of Sheriff Brady and Deputy Hindman. Upon receiving this correspondence, Copeland sent word to Fort Stanton that soldiers were needed in town to prevent the outbreak of violence between the two mobilizing factions. George Coe had been stationed atop the roof of the Ellis store, and he took a shot at one of the Seven Rivers men in his line of sight. The man he shot turned out to be Charlie Cruling, known familiarly as Dutch Charlie. The shot struck him in the ankle, shattering the bone. The two opposing sides then began firing upon one another, and as the town was on the precipice of civil war, 14 soldiers arrived from Fort Stanton to put an end to the skirmish, at least for the time being. But the decisive battles to come in the battle for Lincoln County are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.